The snow came first. Not the gentle drift of winter settling over the northern wastes, but something older, colder. It spread across the tundra like spilled ink, each flake carrying weight that pressed against the earth until the ground itself groaned. The herders noticed it 3 days before the freeze reached their camps. Their livestock refused to graze. The reindeer stood motionless, heads turned north, breath misting in air that shouldn't yet hold such bite. The temperature dropped. By the 3rd day, the dead stood up. A merchant caravan discovered the first village. 23 souls, all accounted for, all upright. They moved in formation, silent and coordinated, clearing snow from paths with mechanical precision. No moans, no shambling. Just purposeful motion, like workers completing a shift that would never end. The merchants fled south, their reports dismissed as hysteria until the pattern repeated. Village after village, the same phenomenon. The dead rose, but they did not hunt. They did not feed. They waited. In the great cities of the New World, mages convened emergency councils. Their scrying revealed something unprecedented, a psychic resonance spreading outward from the northern wastes. Not the chaotic malevolence of typical undead, but something structured, organized, as if a single will commanded legions through thought alone. The Magicians' Guild recorded the energy signature, cataloged it, filed their reports with trembling hands. This was not natural undead animation. This was not even necromancy. This was command. Reconnaissance teams were dispatched. Few returned. Those who did spoke of ice formations jutting from the permafrost, geometric and wrong. They described frost that clung to weapons and armor refusing to melt, even when brought south. And they whispered of a presence vast and patient, waiting beneath layers of ancient ice. The empire of Baharuth withdrew its northern outposts. The Riastai's kingdom fortified its borders. Even the theocracy, with all its holy relics and righteous fury, pulled back from territories that had stood for centuries. Because the snow continued to spread, and with it, the dead continued to rise. On the 7th day, a shard of ice emerged fully from the tundra. It stood 20 feet tall, its surface carved with runes that predated any known language. Frost radiated from it, invisible waves crystallizing moisture in the air. The undead congregated around it, hundreds of corpses standing in concentric circles, their empty eyes fixed on the monument. Some of the markings didn't match the psychic signature the mages were tracking, like a second hand on the same clock ticking toward a different hour. Scholars who later examined the pattern would recognize it. A throne room arrangement, an audience chamber for a sovereign who had not yet claimed his seat. The shard pulsed once. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. And somewhere in that frozen waste, something ancient opened its eyes. It assessed the world with the cold calculation of a conqueror who had learned patience over millennia. This realm was new, different. The magic here operated under unfamiliar rules, and rushing forward would be wasteful. There would be time to understand these variables. Time to map the political landscape. Time to build strength through methodical expansion rather than reckless conquest. The presence exhaled, and winter deepened. In the Sorcerer Kingdom, alarms triggered throughout Nazarick's surveillance wards. Undead activity in the northern territories had spiked beyond acceptable parameters. Not the usual animation of corpses by third-rate necromancers, but something that registered on spells designed to detect catastrophic-scale threats. Ainz Ual-Gaun received the reports in his throne room, skeletal fingers tapping once against obsidian armrests. The pattern disturbed him. Undead didn't organize themselves. They required a master, and masters this competent were rare. dangerous. If this was someone like him, another who understood strategic dominion, then assumptions would be fatal. He summoned his guardians. To the south, in territories still warm enough for agriculture, farmers reported livestock dying in their pens. Not from disease or predation, but from cold that struck without warning. The animals simply stopped breathing frost, forming on their tongues mid-bleat. The slain theocracy's cardinals convened in emergency session. Undead outbreaks were not uncommon in a world where necromancy existed. But this felt different. Coordinated. The spy networks reported impossible numbers, all moving with unified purpose. Suspicion turned immediately to the Sorcerer Kingdom. Who else commanded undead with such precision? Who else possessed the power to raise armies from graveyards across multiple territories? But the spies also noted something troubling. Nazarick's forces were mobilizing, not to attack, but to defend. Their reconnaissance patrols had pulled back from the northern wastes, entirely ceding ground without engagement. That meant whoever commanded this new undead force wasn't allied with the Sorcerer Kingdom, which meant the world had two necromantic powers, and neither knew the other's full capabilities. In the frozen north, the shard continued to pulse. Each beat sent psychic ripples across hundreds of miles, binding the fallen to a singular will. The corpses stood straighter, moved with greater coordination, began clearing pathways through the ice, constructing infrastructure for an army that grew with each nightfall. No banners were raised. No declarations were made. The expansion proceeded in silence, efficient and inevitable, as winter itself. Before the second week ended, 3 border forts had been abandoned. Not overrun, simply vacated when garrisons looked north and understood that holding walls against this tide would be suicide. Better to retreat while retreat remained an option. The refugees brought stories of armored figures rhymed in ice standing vigil over frozen ramparts, of winged silhouettes moving through the blizzards, too deliberate to be birds, too still to be natural, and of a figure glimpsed only at distance, tall, armored in black ice, crowned with something that hummed with terrible power. But these were dismissed as panic-born exaggerations. Surely no being could command such forces. Surely this was temporary, a phenomenon that would fade like winter into spring. The snow disagreed. It continued south, patient and relentless, covering fertile ground under permafrost that refused to thaw. And wherever it settled, the dead waited, silent, organized, ready. In Nazarick, Demiurge completed his initial analysis of the threat patterns. His conclusion disturbed even his supreme intellect. This wasn't random, undead animation. This was telepathic control on a civilizational scale, operating through mechanisms he couldn't fully decode. Someone or something had brought a power to the new world that rivaled their own. And they were building strength with the patience of an entity that measured time in centuries rather than seasons. Ain studied the reports, his paranoia, screaming warnings, his supreme undead nature couldn't express through facial tells. This required investigation, understanding, and potentially decisive action before the threat became unmanageable. He had built the Sorcerer Kingdom through careful planning and overwhelming force. Now something had arrived that understood the same principles. 2 powers, 2 philosophies of undeath. One world too small for both. The pieces were moving into position, though neither side yet understood the shape of the board. And in the north, beneath layers of ancient ice, something that had once been human opened its eyes. Nothing in them belonged to mercy. Winter had found a new home, and winter never surrendered ground willingly. The entity that had once been a prince of men stood motionless at the edge of the shard armor, blackened with frost that predated this world's oldest glaciers. The wind carried no scent. The air held no warmth. Around him, the undead waited in perfect stillness, arranged in concentric patterns that meant nothing to them, but everything to the will that bound them. He did not survey his surroundings with eyes. Eyes were for the living who needed light to process information. What he possessed was awareness, a net of consciousness that spread outward through every corpse that answered to the helm of domination. Through their empty sockets, he saw the tundra. Through their frozen fingers, he felt the texture of snow that would not melt. Through the psychic threads that leashed them to his will, he understood the shape of this new realm. Different. That was the first assessment. The magic here operated under principles that did not match Azeroth's familiar architecture. When he had attempted to raise the first corpses, the process had required adjustment. The souls here clung to flesh differently, and the ambient mana responded to necromantic commands with slight resistance, as if the world itself questioned his authority. He did not force the issue. Force was wasteful when observation could yield better data. The helm pulsed against his temples, sending ripples of domination magic across miles of frozen waste. 63 corpses responded immediately, rising from snowdrifts where they had fallen weeks or months prior. He cataloged each one physical condition, degree of decay, responsiveness to commands. Satisfactory. Not optimal, but workable. Through their collective vision, he examined the settlements visible on the southern horizon. Small, primitive construction compared to what he remembered of human civilization. The architecture suggested a feudal system, kingdoms probably with all the inefficiencies that implied. Borders, territories, resources divided by lines drawn in sand rather than necessity. All of it would serve. He did not move from his position. Movement implied urgency, and urgency implied weakness. Instead, he extended his awareness further, pushing the helm's reach to its current limit. The psychic network stretched thin at the edges, but it held. Through scattered undead across the northern territories, he gathered information. Population centers, military installations, travel routes, agricultural patterns. The living here were fragmented. Multiple kingdoms, each suspicious of the others. He recognized the pattern. It was the same petty tribalism that had plagued Lordaeron before the Scourge unified it under singular purpose. These nations would resist cooperation even when cooperation offered their only chance of survival. That made them predictable. A distant awareness flickered at the edge of his network. Something had noticed the undead activity. Not the scattered reports of peasants, those were inevitable and irrelevant, but something more focused. Magical surveillance, precise and methodical. He isolated the thread of observation, traced it back to its source. South. Concentrated power. An organized force with resources comparable to what the Kirin Tor had once possessed. Though the signature felt different. Darker. He filed the information without concern. Let them watch. Let them catalog the undead movements and draw their conclusions. By the time they understood what they were observing, the foundation would already be laid. The helm whispered opportunities through his consciousness. Raise more, expand faster, claim territory while they hesitate. He dismissed the impulses. The artifact amplified will into action, but will without strategy was the domain of beasts. He had not conquered Northrend through reckless aggression. He had done it through patience, through understanding the terrain, before claiming it through building infrastructure that would endure, rather than monuments to fleeting power. This world would be no different. Through one of his undead sentries, a former soldier who had frozen to death during a patrol 3 months prior. He observed a military convoy retreating from a northern outpost. 47 soldiers, 3 supply wagons, 2 horses that flinched at the cold despite their training. They moved with discipline, but their eyes kept darting toward the tree line. Afraid. Good. Fear was information. Fear told him they had seen enough to understand the threat existed, but not enough to comprehend its scale. The helm urged him to take them. Fresh corpses, trained bodies that would rise as superior servants. He considered it for 3 seconds, then dismissed the action. The convoy's disappearance would trigger investigation. Investigation would bring stronger forces. Stronger forces would reveal capabilities he had not yet mapped. Better to let them run. Better to let them report. Better to spread the fears slowly, like winter itself, until resistance collapsed before the first true blow was struck. He allocated consciousness to terrain analysis. The permafrost here was shallow compared to Northrend. Beneath it, the ground remained workable, not ideal for permanent fortifications, but sufficient for staging areas. The tree line to the south would provide materials for construction. The abandoned villages could be repurposed as supply depots. The mountains to the east formed a natural defensive barrier that could be leveraged. A fragment of sensation, not quite pain, not quite pressure, pressed against the edges of his awareness. Something was probing the psychic network, not breaching it, but testing its boundaries, like fingers pressed against a locked door. He focused on the intrusion, analyzing its nature. Sophisticated. Whoever commanded this surveillance possessed expertise in mental magic that rivaled what the Lich King himself had once wielded as a mortal archmage. The probe withdrew before he could trace it fully, but the signature lingered. Calculated, cautious, intelligent. An opponent worth noting. He redistributed his undead across a wider perimeter, creating gaps in the network that would appear natural, the result of terrain and decay, rather than deliberate positioning. Let the observers see what they expected, a growing undead presence, dangerous but comprehensible. Let them believe they understood the threat's shape, while the true foundation solidified beneath their notice. The frozen throne shard pulsed again, and fresh power flooded through the network. Not an increase in strength, but an increase in efficiency. The corpses moved with slightly better coordination. The psychic threads required fractionally less effort to maintain. Good. The artifact was acclimating to this world's magical framework, learning its rules and adapting. He would do the same. Through multiple undead perspectives, he observed the southern territories, farmland still yielding crops, merchants moving goods between settlements, soldiers drilling in courtyards that had never known siege. All of it proceeding as if the world remained stable, as if winter was something that would pass. They did not yet understand. He had been winter's avatar for so long that the distinction between the Lich King and the concept had blurred into irrelevance. Arthas had worried about morality. Ner'zhul had worried about servitude. What remained after their merger worried only about efficiency, and efficiency demanded patience. The undead around him stood motionless, waiting for commands that would not come yet. Through their collective stillness, he continued his observation. Population estimates, resource distribution, political boundaries, military capabilities. Every detail cataloged, every pattern analyzed, every variable accounted for. When he finally moved, it would be with complete understanding of the board's configuration. Until then, the dead could wait. They were very good at waiting. Somewhere to the south in territories still warm enough for life to flourish. Carelessly, decisions were being made. Councils were convening. Strategies were being proposed. Forces were mobilizing in response to reports of undead activity in the northern wastes. He monitored it all with the detachment of an architect reviewing blueprints. Let them plan. Let them prepare. Their preparations would reveal their capabilities, and their capabilities would inform his next adjustment. The helm whispered again: expansion, conquest, domination. He acknowledged the impulses and set them aside. There would be time for all of that. Time measured not in days or weeks, but in the slow accumulation of advantages that would make victory inevitable rather than uncertain. He had learned that lesson on the frozen throne. Power without preparation led to Pyrrhic victories. Strength without strategy led to overextension. Conquest without foundation led to collapse. This world would not see those mistakes repeated. Through the psychic network, he felt the distant magic users continuing their surveillance, watching, analyzing, drawing conclusions from incomplete data. He allowed them their observations. Every moment they spent studying his current forces was a moment they weren't discovering his actual intentions. The shard beneath his feet pulsed once more, sending another wave of cold across the tundra. Ice crystals formed in geometric patterns across the snow, each one a perfect echo of the helm's architecture. Beautiful in its way. Proof that chaos could be brought to order, that randomness could be structured, that life's messy impermanence could be replaced with death's clean certainty. He did not admire the patterns. Admiration was for those who still experienced aesthetic pleasure. He simply noted them as confirmation that the domination magic was spreading correctly, that the foundation was solidifying, that the infrastructure of conquest was being built brick by frozen brick. In the distance, a crow landed on one of the undead sentries. It pecked twice at the corpse's shoulder, found nothing of interest, and flew away. The Lich King tracked its flight path through multiple undead perspectives, noting how the bird instinctively avoided flying directly over the shard. Animals could sense what humans rationalized away. The crow knew this territory had become wrong. The crow would not return. Small confirmation, but confirmation nonetheless. He allocated a portion of his consciousness to long-term planning. Phase 1 observation and foundation building. Phase 2 controlled expansion to test response capabilities. Phase 3 strategic positioning for inevitable conflict. No timeline. Timelines created pressure, and pressure created mistakes. The work would proceed at the pace efficiency demanded, neither faster nor slower. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant fires. Villages, probably. Settlements where the living still believed warmth could hold back the cold. He did not send undead to investigate. Not yet. Let them keep their fires. Let them believe safety existed in numbers and walls. When winter came for them, it would not announce itself. It would simply arrive patient and inevitable as the dawn. The helm pulsed in rhythm with his thoughts, amplifying the cold certainty that had replaced everything human. Arthas would have hesitated. Ner'zhul would have raged. What remained did neither. It assessed. It planned. It waited. And the dead waited with it perfect in their silence, ready for commands that would come when the time was correct, and not one moment sooner. Winter had found a new world, and winter would claim it the way it claimed everything slowly, inevitably, without mercy or malice. Simply because that was what winter did. Ainz Ualgaun sat upon the throne of kings, skeletal fingers motionless against black obsidian. The pose was perfect, shoulders squared, spine straight, every angle calculated to project absolute authority. Inside, where emotions should have lived, his thoughts churned with variables he couldn't fully account for. The surveillance reports lay across the round table in organized stacks. Demiurge had prepared them with his usual thoroughness, undead activity mapped by geographic zone timeline of escalation comparative analysis against known necromantic patterns. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Someone competent had arrived. "My lord?" Albedo's voice carried the weight of formal address, though her golden eyes held the warmth she reserved exclusively for him. "The Guardians await your assessment." Ains allowed himself a single nod. The motion triggered his passive skills. Supreme Being's authority flooded the chamber with presence that made even the air feel heavier. Good. Let them see confidence. Let them believe he understood the full scope of what they were facing. He understood perhaps 30%. The Guardian stood arrayed before him in perfect formation. Albedo at his right-hand posture, immaculate. Demiurge to her side, hands clasped behind his back, in that way that meant his mind was already 3 scenarios ahead. Shaltair leaned against her spewit lance with calculated casualness, blood-red eyes tracking the room's shadows. Cocytus stood like a monument of ice and steel, utterly still. Aura and Mare flanked the chamber's rear, the dark elf twins watching their creator with the absolute faith that simultaneously warmed and terrified him. "Demiurge." Ains kept his tone level authoritative. "Your analysis." The demon straightened fractionally, a gesture of acknowledgement, not submission. Never submission. The Guardians didn't kneel to weakness, and Ains had learned that appearing uncertain would shatter the carefully constructed image of infallibility they'd built around him. "My lord, the pattern is unprecedented." Demiurge stepped forward, one hand gesturing toward the reports. "Standard undead animation follows predictable inefficiencies. Necromancers raise corpses individually. Even skilled practitioners must maintain each servant through continuous magical investment. What we're observing violates these principles." Ains listened, processing. He'd noticed the same discrepancies, but hearing Demiurge articulate them helped crystallize the threat. "The undead in the northern territories move with unified purpose," Demiurge continued. "Not the shambling disorder of typical reanimation, but coordinated action suggesting centralized control. Telepathic command, most likely, operating at a scale that should require either world-class artifacts or..." He paused, and Ains recognized the hesitation. "Or capabilities similar to our own." The chamber stilled. Ains felt the familiar spike of anxiety that his undead nature immediately suppressed. This was the scenario he'd dreaded since arriving in the new world, encountering another player. Someone who understood the same mechanics he did. Someone who might recognize him for what he truly was, a salaryman pretending to be an undead overlord. But showing fear now would be catastrophic. Interesting. He let the word hang as if he'd already anticipated this possibility, as if he'd been testing them to see who would reach the correct conclusion first. "And the source, unknown, my lord." Albedo's interruption was smooth, deferential. "Our scrying attempts have been inconclusive. Whatever commands these forces operates from beyond standard detection methods. We've traced the epicenter to the Frost Veil region, but direct observation proves difficult." Cocytus shifted a sound like glaciers grinding. "Perhaps. A. Reconnaissance. Force. Would. Yield. Data." Ains considered. Sending Guardians to investigate would reveal Nazarick's capabilities. Not sending them would leave him operating on incomplete information. Both options carried risk. Both could lead to disaster if he chose incorrectly. What would a true Supreme Being do? The answer came with uncomfortable clarity they would already know. Touch Me would have assessed the threat instantly. Ulbert would have calculated the optimal response. Any of the other guild members would have acted with confidence born from actually understanding the situation. Ains had only paranoia and the desperate hope that looking decisive would suffice. Not yet. He delivered the words with absolute certainty, as if delay was part of some grander strategy. Premature engagement reveals our hand. We observe. We gather intelligence. We move only when we understand the full scope of what we're facing. Relief flickered across Albedo's features, relief that he was being cautious, probably. Relief that he wasn't charging blindly into unknown danger. She didn't realize he was simply terrified of making a mistake. A wise approach, my lord. Demiurge's smile held genuine admiration. This entity's patience suggests strategic thinking. They've expanded gradually, testing boundaries without overcommitting forces. Classic infiltration methodology. They're mapping the political landscape before committing to conquest. That observation sent metaphorical ice, since Ains lacked the capacity for temperature sensation through his thoughts. Because it was exactly what he would do, what he had done in fact when Nazarick first arrived in this world, which meant he was dealing with someone who thought like him, someone competent, someone dangerous. Shalter. He turned his gaze to the vampire. Your assessment of their undead quality. She straightened, predatory focus sharpening. From what our scouts reported, functional, not exceptional. They move with purpose, but I've seen better animation in the cat's planes. If these are their elite forces, they're manageable. If they're chaff... She let the implication hang. Then, whoever commanded them had reserves they hadn't yet deployed. Ains processed this. Weak undead suggested either limited power or deliberate restraint. Given Demiurge's earlier analysis about strategic patience restraint seemed more likely, which meant they were dealing with an opponent who valued information gathering over immediate dominance, an opponent who, like him, feared overextension. The thought was oddly comforting. If this entity was being cautious, it meant they didn't know Nazarick's capabilities any more than he knew theirs. Both sides operating blind. Both testing boundaries. A cold war, then. One that would remain cold only so long as neither side felt confident enough to strike first. Albedo. He shifted attention to his overseer. What of the New World nations? Their response, panic, my lord, as expected. Her lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. The Riestes kingdom has withdrawn border patrols. Baharuth fortified their northern trade routes. Even the theocracy pulled back from territories they've held for centuries. She paused, golden eyes gleaming. Several minor nations are already seeking protection. Ains caught the subtext. Nations that would have rejected alliance with the Sorcerer Kingdom now found themselves desperate enough to consider it. The undead threat was driving them toward Nazarick, whether they wanted to come or not. Strategic opportunity wrapped in existential danger. And their speculation about the source. Albedo's expression darkened. Divided. Some believe it's us, that the Sorcerer Kingdom is expanding through new proxies. Others think it's an unknown entity. The theocracy appears convinced we're involved regardless of evidence. Of course they were. The theocracy saw undead and immediately blamed the most visible necromantic power in the region. Logic from their perspective. Dangerous for Nazarick because it meant they were already treating this as an extension of his influence. Which meant if this unknown entity did something catastrophic, the theocracy would hold him responsible. Demiurge. Ains made the decision quickly before doubt could paralyze him. Draft diplomatic communiques to the major powers. Make it clear that the Sorcerer Kingdom is not responsible for the northern undead activity. We are, however, willing to share intelligence and coordinate responses to this mutual threat. Masterful, my lord. Demiurge's admiration was immediate and genuine. Position Nazarick as a stabilizing force rather than a suspect. Leverage the crisis to build alliances while simultaneously gathering information from their independent investigations. We benefit regardless of their response. Cooperation yields data rejection, confirms their future irrelevance. Ains hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but he nodded as if that had been his plan all along. This was his survival strategy: make vague pronouncements and let Demiurge's brilliance fill in the details. Mare. He turned to the younger dark elf twin. Prepare observation posts along our northern borders. I want monitoring stations that can detect undead movement without engaging. Prioritize concealment over defensive capability. Yes, Lord Ains. Mare's stutter didn't diminish his competence. The boy would build exactly what was needed, probably exceeding specifications. Cositus, you'll oversee the defensive perimeter. If these undead cross into our territory, I want controlled engagement. Capture specimens for analysis, but avoid escalation. Understood, my lord. The pieces were moving into position. Not because Ains had a master plan, but because the Guardians were so talented they could execute brilliance from his improvisation. He just needed to avoid catastrophic mistakes long enough for their competence to compensate for his uncertainty. One additional concern, my lord. Demiurge's tone shifted slightly, still respectful but carrying an edge of genuine puzzlement. The necromantic signature is unusual. It doesn't match any documented magical tradition from this world. The closest parallel would be certain forbidden techniques from Yggdrasil's lore, but even those don't quite align. Ains felt his anxiety spike again, immediately suppressed by his racial traits. Yggdrasil. The word hung in his thoughts like a blade. If this entity used techniques similar to the game, it meant one of three possibilities. Another player had arrived. Someone had discovered game mechanics independently, or this world's magic had always operated on those principles, and they simply hadn't encountered it yet. All three options terrified him for different reasons. Continue analysis, he said, keeping his voice steady. Cross-reference against all available data. If there are patterns we're missing, I want them found. Of course, my lord. Demiurge bowed slightly. Though I must admit the sophistication suggests perhaps someone of similar intellectual capacity to yourself. A worthy opponent if circumstances force confrontation. The compliment landed like a weight, because Demiurge believed it. Believed that Ains was some tactical genius who already understood everything and was merely testing them. The reality that he was desperately trying not to get everyone killed through incompetent decision-making would shatter their faith entirely. So he nodded, accepted the praise, played the role. This entity is patient, Ains said carefully. Strategic. They're building foundation before committing to expansion. That suggests intelligence, yes. But intelligence can be... He paused, searching for the right word. Predictable. If they think tactically, we can anticipate their moves. Demiurge, I want probability models for their next 3 likely actions. Albedo coordinate with our intelligence network. Someone always knows something. Find who's selling information and buy it before anyone else does. Brilliant, my lord. Albedo's enthusiasm was almost overwhelming, treating their competence as a liability rather than a pure threat. You've already identified the weakness in their strength. Ains wasn't entirely sure what weakness she was referring to, but he maintained his neutral expression. Let her believe. Let them all believe. "We face an unknown enemy," he said, rising from the throne. The guardians immediately straightened to attention. "One who commands undead with precision we must respect. But unknown does not mean unknowable. We gather information. We prepare contingencies. We act only when action serves our interests." He paused, letting the weight of supreme being authority fill the silence. "And if this entity proves hostile, if they threaten Nazarick or our interests in this world, we will respond with overwhelming force. But not today. Today, we watch. We learn. We ensure that when conflict comes, it comes on our terms. For the glory of Nazarick," Albedo's declaration rang through the chamber. The other guardians echoed it, fists to chests, absolute conviction in their voices. Mine stood there watching beings of immense power pledge themselves to his leadership and fought down the familiar terror that one day they'd discover the truth. That their supreme being was just a man playing a role he barely understood. But not today. Today, he'd made decisions that seemed sound. Today, he'd projected confidence and strategic thinking. Today, he'd survived another step in the impossible charade of being Ain's Ool Gown. "Dismissed," he said quietly. The guardians departed with military precision, already moving to execute orders he'd improvised, and they'd interpreted as brilliance. Alone in the throne room, Ains allowed himself one small gesture of uncertainty. His fingers tapped once against the armrest. A habit from his human life. A reminder that beneath the undead overlord's facade, Suzuki Satoru still existed, terrified and out of his depth. Somewhere to the north, an unknown entity was building power with patient precision, and Ain's Ool Gown had no idea if he'd just made the right decisions or set Nazarick on a path to disaster. All he could do was project confidence and hope his guardian's brilliance would turn improvisation into victory. Again, like always. The throne room's silence offered no answers. Only the endless weight of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. The Cardinal Council convened in chambers designed to inspire faith through intimidation. Vaulted ceilings soared overhead, carved with scenes of divine judgment. Golden sunbursts adorned every surface, catching candlelight and throwing shadows that made the white-robed figures seated around the obsidian table appear to float in holy radiance. Cardinal Raymond Zarg Lorentzen did not feel inspired. He felt trapped between two apocalypses and expected to choose which one would kill them slower. "The reports are conclusive." Cardinal Berenice Nagua Santini's voice carried the clipped precision of someone who'd spent decades turning uncertainty into doctrine. Her fingers rested on parchment covered in spy network dispatch codes. Undead activity in the Northern Territories has increased 1,700% in 3 weeks. Pattern analysis confirms centralized command. Multiple settlements report coordinated movements inconsistent with typical necromantic animation. Raymond studied the map spread before them. Red markers indicated confirmed undead sightings. Each cluster formed geometric patterns, sweeps, perimeters, search grids. The kind of organization that required intelligence. And our friends in the Sorcerer Kingdom. Cardinal Dominic. Yer Partouche leaned forward, his aged hands folded in a way that suggested prayer, but conveyed threat. "Surely this bears their signature." "Our intelligence suggests otherwise." Berenice's tone didn't waver. "Nazarick's forces have withdrawn from northern patrol routes. Their surveillance networks are active but defensive. Every indication points to them responding to this threat, not orchestrating it." Silence settled over the council chamber. Raymond watched his colleagues process the implications. If Nazarick wasn't responsible, it meant the world had acquired a second necromantic superpower. If they were lying about their involvement, it meant they were confident enough to deploy forces while maintaining plausible deniability. Both options terrified him. What does the undead king claim? Dominic's question carried skepticism that went beyond healthy caution into active hostility. Nothing yet. Berenice consulted her notes. No official statement, but merchant contacts report increased military activity around Irantel. Fortifications being reinforced, long-range scrying spells detected along their borders, defensive posture, not aggressive expansion. Raymond made his decision. I want verification, independent observation, not merchant gossip. Send our best. Clearwater is already en route. Berenice's answer came too quickly. She'd anticipated his order. Good. That meant she was thinking several moves ahead. He departed 4 days ago with authorization to observe both the Northern Undead and Nazarick's response. No engagement, no exposure. Pure intelligence gathering. The name triggered recognition. Ian Clearwater, Black Scripture candidate who'd failed final trials but proved exceptional at infiltration. Too visible for assassination work, too competent to waste on standard operations. Perfect for a mission where survival mattered less than the intelligence dying. What are his orders if he's discovered? Raymond kept his voice neutral. Suicide protocols. Berenice met his gaze without flinching. We cannot afford to have our investigation methods exposed to either party. If Clearwater is compromised, he takes what he knows to the grave. Professional. Cold. Necessary. Raymond hated that he'd stopped questioning such measures years ago. And the other kingdoms? Dominic shifted topics with the smooth efficiency of someone redirecting conversation before objections could form. How are they responding? Panic. Cardinal Ivan Yasna Drakroa spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the tired weight of someone delivering bad news they'd already internalized. Riestes has abandoned 3 northern outposts. Baharuth fortified trade routes and recalled military observers. Even the smaller nations are withdrawing from territories they've held for generations. Everyone's retreating and no one's coordinating. Exactly the scenario Raymond had feared. Fragmented response individual nations making decisions based on incomplete information and self-preservation instinct. The kind of chaos that would make organized conquest trivial for anyone patient enough to wait. Proposals. He directed the question to the full council. Berenice answered first. We leverage the crisis, offer intelligence sharing and coordination in exchange for increased theocracy influence, position ourselves as the stabilizing force while others panic. That assumes we have intelligence worth sharing. Dominic's objection carried edge. Currently, we know approximately nothing. Undead are rising in the north. They're organized. That's the extent of verified information. Everything else is speculation. Speculation based on pattern analysis, which could be wrong. Dominic cut across Berenice's defense. We don't know if this is a single entity or multiple necromancers coordinating. We don't know their objectives beyond obvious territorial expansion. We don't know if they're allied with Nazarick despite the undead king's convenient defensive posture. We're flying blind and pretending it's reconnaissance. The argument would continue in circles unless Raymond intervened. He'd seen this debate play out in a dozen council sessions, Berenice's aggressive information gathering versus Dominic's demand for certainty. Both had merit. Neither would yield. We proceed on multiple tracks. Raymond's voice carried the authority of final decision. Berenice, continue intelligence operations. I want eyes on both the northern threat and Nazarick's response. Dominic, you're correct that we lack certainty. Therefore, prepare contingencies for multiple scenarios. If this is Nazarick's deception, we respond accordingly. If it's a separate threat, we adjust. We plan for both. The council members nodded. Professional agreement masking fundamental disagreement about priorities. Raymond had learned to accept such compromises. Unity of purpose was a luxury. Unity of action would suffice. One additional concern. Yvonne's interjection carried hesitation. Several minor nations are already approaching Nazarick for protection. They're frightened enough to seek alliance with the undead king, rather than face the northern threat alone. That crystallized the true danger. Not the undead themselves, but the political destabilization they created. Nations that had resisted Nazarick's expansion, now throwing themselves at the sorcerer kingdom, because they feared something worse. Which nations? Raymond needed specifics. Minor border territories. Nothing strategically critical yet, but the pattern concerns me. If larger kingdoms begin seeking Nazarick's protection, he didn't need to finish. If major powers allied with the Sorcerer Kingdom, the theocracy's entire strategic position collapsed. They'd built decades of policy on containing Nazarick through coalition and mutual defense. If that coalition fractured, they'd face the undead king's power without buffer states. Recommendations. Raymond looked to each cardinal in turn. Counteroffer. Berenice's response was immediate. We approach those same nations, offer theocracy military support and intelligence, undercut Nazarick's appeal by providing protection without requiring alliance with undead. That commits our forces to defending territories we can't adequately support. Dominic's objection was tactically sound. We're already stretched maintaining our own borders. Extending guarantees to minor nations spreads our military beyond sustainable capacity. Then we don't actually defend them. Berenice's smile carried no warmth. We make the offer knowing they'll refuse our terms. But the diplomatic gesture positions us as the reasonable alternative to undead alliance. When they inevitably choose Nazarick anyway, we've established narrative that they rejected salvation. Raymond recognized the strategy political theater designed to maintain moral authority while accepting tactical defeat. Pragmatic, cynical, probably correct. Approved. He moved to the next agenda item before objections could form. Military disposition. 6 scriptures remain on standard deployment. Yvonne consulted his notes. Black scripture is available for emergency deployment, but I recommend holding them in reserve until we understand what we're facing. Committing our elite forces to reconnaissance would be wasteful. Agreed. Hold Black scripture at ready status. What about conventional forces? 20% increase in border patrols. We've recalled missionary delegations from contested territories and redeployed temple guards to strategic locations. Overall defensive posture without obvious militarization that might provoke Nazarick or the northern threat. Professional competence. Raymond appreciated Yvonne's ability to translate political decisions into military action without requiring explicit orders. The theocracy functioned because key personnel understood objectives without needing every detail spelled out. One final matter. Berenice's tone shifted slightly, still professional, but carrying personal investment. The undead signature. Our analysts can't identify the source tradition. It doesn't match documented necromancy from any known nation or magical school. The closest parallel would be ancient techniques pre-catastrophe era. but even those don't align precisely. That sent cold assessment through Raymond's thoughts. Unknown magical tradition meant unknown capabilities. Unknown capabilities meant unpredictable threat assessment. Everything the theocracy had built relied on understanding their enemies well enough to counter them. This violated that fundamental requirement. Speculation on origin. 3 theories. Berenice ticked them off with clinical precision. First, someone discovered lost magical knowledge and is applying it. Second, this entity is from beyond our documented world, another continent, another realm. Third, they've been here all along, building power in secret, and only now revealed themselves. All 3 possibilities were nightmare scenarios for different reasons. Which do you consider most likely unknown? Berenice's admission of ignorance carried more weight than most people's certainties. We lack data. That's what Clearwater's mission addresses. If he returns with actionable intelligence, we can refine our theories. If he doesn't return... She left the implication hanging. Then they'd know the threat was lethal enough to kill one of their best operatives without leaving evidence. Information purchased through absence. Raymond stood signaling the council session's conclusion. The cardinals rose in synchronized motion, white robes rustling like wings. Continue monitoring both situations. I want daily briefings on any developments. If the northern threat advances beyond current territory, if Nazarick makes significant military movements, if any nation changes alliance status, immediate notification, regardless of hour. Professional nods. They dispersed with the practiced efficiency of people who'd spent decades translating divine mandate into bureaucratic function. Alone in the chamber, Raymond allowed himself a moment of honest assessment. The theocracy faced 2 undead powers, multiple political crises and information gaps that made strategic planning nearly impossible. They were reacting to events they didn't understand, making decisions based on incomplete intelligence, and hoping their responses wouldn't trigger the exact catastrophes they were trying to prevent. Standard operating procedure, really. He gathered the reports, locked them in the obsidian vault, and departed through corridors designed to make even cardinals feel small before divine authority. 300 miles north. Ian Clearwater crouched in frozen underbrush and questioned every decision that had led him to this moment. The undead patrol passed 20 feet from his position. 6 corpses moving in perfect formation, their movements synchronized in ways that violated every principle of standard necromancy. No shambling, no independence. They moved like fingers on a hand, individual components of a single will. He'd been observing for 2 days, watching patterns, cataloging behaviors, trying to understand the intelligence behind the animation. What he'd learned terrified him more than the undead themselves. This wasn't random resurrection. This was infrastructure. The corpses cleared snow from pathways, repaired damaged structures, transported materials with purposeful coordination. They were building something not mindlessly following orders, but executing a plan that required logistics and long-term thinking, which meant whoever commanded them thought in terms of occupation, not conquest. Ian shifted position carefully, conscious of every sound. His thermal suppression spells kept him invisible to magical detection, but physical observation remained possible. One mistake, one snapped branch, and those corpses would investigate. He had no illusions about surviving that encounter. The patrol disappeared into the tree line. Ian waited 30 seconds, then began his withdrawal. He'd gathered enough information for today. The Cardinals wanted data about organizational structure, command patterns, expansion vectors. He'd mapped 15 patrol routes, documented 3 supply depots, and confirmed the existence of what appeared to be a central command location. Some kind of ice formation that radiated power he could detect from a mile away. He'd also confirmed something the Cardinals wouldn't want to hear. This entity was professional, patient, building foundation. Before committing to expansion, exactly the approach a competent strategist would use when entering unfamiliar territory. The theocracy was dealing with someone who thought like them. Ian reached his camp 3 miles south, a carefully concealed position that allowed quick escape routes in multiple directions. He'd learned early in his career that survival depended on having exit strategies planned before you needed them. He pulled out his encrypted communication crystal, began composing his report. In the abbreviated code, Black Scripture candidates learned before field deployment. The Cardinals would want verification of every observation cross-referenced with existing intelligence formatted for their analytical frameworks. He'd give them facts. Let them form their own conclusions about implications. The crystal pulsed, confirming transmission. Somewhere in Theocracy headquarters, analysts were already processing his data, feeding it into their threat assessment models, adjusting strategic recommendations. Ian extinguished his heating enchantment, settled into the cold discipline of patient observation, and wondered if he'd survive long enough to see what the Cardinals decided to do with his information. Probably not. But the intelligence would survive. That's what mattered. The mission continued. The pass cut through frozen mountains like a wound. Ice-slicked stone rose on both sides, creating a natural choke point that funneled travel through a corridor barely wide enough for 3 wagons abreast. Snow accumulated in drifts that transformed the landscape into abstract geometry, white against gray, broken only by the dark shapes of abandoned supply crates and the skeletal remains of merchant caravans that hadn't retreated fast enough. Ian Clearwater observed from his concealed position on the eastern ridge. He'd been tracking undead movement patterns for 6 days, documenting the infrastructure they were building across the northern territories. What he witnessed now changed everything. The corpses were massing. Not the scattered patrol groups he'd been cataloging, but hundreds of them converging on the pass with coordinated precision that suggested unified command. They moved in formation. Vanguard main body, rear guard. Military organization applied to the dead. This wasn't reconnaissance anymore. This was mobilization. He activated his communication crystal, transmitted a priority alert to Theocracy headquarters, then went silent. Whatever was about to happen, the Cardinals needed warning. Whether he survived to provide detailed analysis was secondary. The undead reached the pass entrance and stopped. All of them. Hundreds of corpses freezing mid-step like puppets whose strings had been cut. The sudden stillness was more unnerving than their approach. Ian tracked his gaze along their formation, searching for command structure. There at the rear, barely visible through the snow. A figure that didn't match the shambling mass. Taller. Armored in something that drank light. The helmet wore pulsed with energy that made Ian's detection spells spike warning. Then the corpses surged forward. Albedo received the alert before Nazarick's perimeter wards even triggered. Demiurge's intelligence network had flagged unusual undead concentration 3 hours prior. Mayor's observation posts reported mass movement 2 hours after that. Now the surveillance constructs were transmitting direct visual hundreds of undead advancing through Frost Veil Pass with clear intent to breach the buffer zone Aints had established between their territory and the unknown threat. Lord Ains. She kept her voice level despite the combat readiness flooding her systems. They're moving. The throne room's strategic display updated in real time. Red markers representing undead forces flowing through the pass like blood through an artery. Nazarick's defensive positions marked in blue holding formation at the southern terminus, where the pass opened onto flatter ground. Ayn stood from the throne, and Albedo felt the familiar surge of absolute faith. Her creator had anticipated this. Of course he had. Every preparation over the past weeks had been building toward this moment. Deployment. His question was directed to Demiurge, who'd materialized at the tactical table with scrolls already unfurled. Recommendation: limited engagement. Demiurge's fingers traced vectors across the map. We establish our capabilities while gathering intelligence on theirs. Cositus anchors the choke point. Shaltair handles aerial threats and elite targets. Aura and Mare provide battlefield control. You and I maintain reserve position with strategic intervention capability. Albedo. Ains turned to her, and she straightened under his gaze. I want frontline command. Let them see what Nazarick brings to direct confrontation. Her smile carried edge. And I want to understand what we're facing before we commit to larger operations. Ains nodded once. Approved. Rules of engagement: capture specimens when possible, eliminate threats when necessary. I want prisoners for interrogation. Understand their command structure before we dismantle it. Albedo saluted, fist to chest. For the glory of Nazarick. The other guardians echoed her declaration, and then they were moving teleportation circles, activating combat buffs, cascading through their forms, centuries of loyalty, channeled into disciplined violence. Okay. The Lich King observed the confrontation from 300 perspectives simultaneously. Through the eyes of his undead vanguard, he watched the southern force deploy. Not human soldiers. Something else. Entities that radiated power comparable to what he remembered from Azeroth's champions, perhaps stronger. Interesting. He allocated consciousness to tactical assessment. The armored female leading the enemy force moved with precision that suggested extensive combat experience. The insect warrior controlling ice magic in the choke point demonstrated mastery over winter itself, a mirror to his own capabilities. The vampire engaging his aerial units, Valkyr, he'd deployed for reconnaissance, possessed speed and lethality that would make her dangerous even without her obvious necromantic resistances. This was the organized force he'd detected weeks ago. The surveillance presence that had been probing his network. Now they'd committed to direct engagement, revealing capabilities he could analyze and counter. He raised his hand, not physically, but through the psychic threads binding his forces. The undead vanguard accelerated, crashing into the enemy line, like a wave hitting stone. Cositus's blade swept through 10 corpses in a single motion. They crumbled frost, shattering their animate forms before they could regenerate. Good. The undead here were vulnerable to elemental damage, unlike some varieties that required holy magic or specific countermeasures. Main, force, advancing. His voice rumbled across the battlefield. Behind him, Aura's beasts tore into flanking undead, while Mare's earth magic reshaped the pass itself, creating barriers that funneled the enemy advance into kill zones. Shaltair descended from above her spit lance, punching through a Valkyr's chest before the winged creature could complete whatever spell it was channeling. Blood actually sprayed, not the dry ichor most undead leaked, and Shaltair's smile widened with genuine pleasure. Finally, something that bleeds properly. Albedo ignored the vampire's enthusiasm, focused on the larger pattern. The undead weren't mindlessly charging. They were testing responses, probing for weaknesses in formation. Every wave revealed slightly different tactics, flanking maneuvers, concentrated assault on specific guardians, attempts to break through defensive lines at predicted weak points. Someone was learning from each engagement and adjusting strategy in real time. That confirmed Demiurge's earlier assessment. This wasn't random necromancy. This was an intelligence conducting battlefield analysis through expendable forces. Shall tear fall back to secondary position. They're studying your combat patterns. Albedo's order cut across the chaos. Cositus rotation. Mare collapsed. The eastern approach forced them through the central corridor. The Guardians adjusted instantly, and the undead advance faltered. Not because they'd been defeated, but because the intelligence commanding them recognized the formation change and was recalculating approach vectors. Proof of adaptive strategy. Proof of competence. Proof they were dealing with someone dangerous. Sarah. Ainz watched through, scrying, his skeletal fingers motionless against the throne's armrest. The battle was proceeding exactly as Demiurge had predicted. Limited engagement capability, demonstration, intelligence gathering through controlled confrontation. But something felt wrong. The undead weren't trying to win. They were testing. Every wave assessed Guardian responses, cataloged abilities, mapped defensive positions. Whoever commanded them was using this engagement the same way Ainz would, as reconnaissance with acceptable losses. Which meant they were smart enough to sacrifice hundreds of undead for information. Which meant they were smart enough to be planning something bigger. His paranoia spiked immediately, suppressed by undead emotional regulation. He needed to think tactically, not react from fear. What would a competent opponent do after gathering this intelligence? They'd wait. Analyze. Prepare counters, or they'd escalate immediately before Nazarick could adjust based on what they'd learned today. Demiurge noticed his hesitation. "My lord, something concerns you." Ainz made his decision. Prepare to deploy. Goal of all life is death. If this entity is testing our capabilities, let's provide a data point they can't ignore. Brilliant. Demiurge's admiration was genuine. Demonstrate overwhelming force to discourage escalation, while simultaneously gathering reaction data to their most extreme threat. You're forcing them to reveal counter-strategies prematurely. That wasn't exactly what Ainz had been thinking, but he nodded, as if it had been his plan all along. Let Demiurge interpret his paranoia as tactical brilliance. The outcome would be the same: survival. Teleporting to battlefield. Ainz rose from the throne. Notify Albedo. Full withdrawal to safe distance on my signal. The Lich King felt the shift in magical pressure before visual confirmation. Something powerful had entered the battlefield, a presence that registered on his awareness like the sun breaking through winter clouds. Not through heat or light, but through the simple weight of concentrated power. Through his undead network, he observed the new arrival. Skeletal figure in ornate robes, staff radiating energy that made the air crystallize. The other entities retreated immediately, clearing space around their apparent leader. Tactical priority reassessment. This was the true threat. The force he'd been searching for, the intelligence behind the organized resistance. The skeletal mage raised its staff, and the Lich King recognized spell architecture that didn't match this world's magical framework. Too efficient. Too perfect. Like something designed rather than discovered. Alarm registered through his consciousness. If this entity possessed knowledge similar to his own, if they understood principles that shouldn't exist in this realm, then assumptions about relative power needed immediate revision. The spell completed. Goal of all life is death. Ainz's voice carried no emotion because his racial traits wouldn't permit it, but internally he felt the familiar spike of anxiety. This was his most powerful ability, the skill that had turned impossible battles in Yggdrasil. Using it here meant revealing a trump card, but letting this enemy continue gathering intelligence without understanding the stakes would be worse. The Eclipse class skill activated reality, bending around the spell's architecture. 12 seconds. That's how long he had before the amplification effect peaked. 12 seconds to position properly, to ensure maximum impact, to demonstrate exactly why engaging Nazarick directly was a catastrophic mistake. Cry of the Banshee. The spell cascaded outward, amplified by goal of all life is death into something that transcended normal, instant death magic. Corpses collapsed in waves, their animation severed not at the magical level, but at the conceptual one. Even undead immune to normal death effects crumbled, because goal of all life is death didn't kill them, it ended their existence as valid targets for continued animation. 300 undead ceased functioning in 6 seconds. The avalanche of simultaneous terminations created a psychic shockwave through whatever network controlled them. Ains felt it through his own necromantic senses, a massive disruption, like cutting hundreds of strings at once. Time stop. The battlefield froze. Undead locked mid-motion guardian formations captured in tactical perfection, even falling snow suspended in crystal stillness. Ains walked through the frozen moment observing. The remaining undead showed no sign of recovering from the goal of all life, his death severing. Good. That meant permanent destruction, not temporary disruption. But something else caught his attention. At the pass's northern entrance, barely visible through the snow, a figure stood motionless, not frozen by time stop. The spell didn't affect entities powerful enough to resist it, but still. Watching. Evaluating. Time resumed. The Guardians didn't miss a beat, capitalizing on the enemy's devastation with ruthless efficiency. Within 90 seconds, the battlefield was clear except for scattered corpses that wouldn't rise again. Silence settled over Frost Veil Pass. Ains maintained his position, staff raised, projecting absolute confidence despite the terror screaming through his mind. Because that figure at the northern entrance hadn't retreated, hadn't advanced, just stood there studying the carnage with what Ains recognized as analytical assessment. They'd both revealed capabilities today. They'd both confirmed the other posed genuine threat, and neither was confident enough to commit to total war based on current intelligence. Stalemate. The Lich King withdrew his perception from the battlefield, leaving only a skeletal observation post to monitor for additional developments. Through those limited senses, he watched the enemy forces consolidate position at the pass's southern terminus, establishing fortifications that confirmed they intended to hold this territory. He allocated consciousness to analysis. The skeletal mage's spell had been devastatingly effective, instant death magic amplified beyond normal parameters, followed by temporal manipulation that suggested mastery over fundamental magical laws. Concerning, but not overwhelming. The entity had revealed its most powerful capabilities in a display clearly meant to discourage escalation, which meant they were cautious, unsure of his full strength, unwilling to commit to total confrontation without better intelligence. Exactly how the Lich King himself was thinking. Two strategic minds, both operating from incomplete information, both choosing calculated restraint over potentially catastrophic aggression. He could respect that, in the abstract way he respected any efficient decision-making process. The helm pulsed against his temples, urging continued expansion. He dismissed the impulse. Today's engagement had provided exactly what he needed: confirmation that the organized force possessed genuine power, tactical discipline, and most importantly, limitations. They deployed their supreme ability as deterrent, which meant they wanted to avoid prolonged conflict as much as he did. That created opportunity, not for conquest, for negotiation. The concept settled into his consciousness with the inevitability of winter. He would build strength. They would fortify position. And when both sides had mapped each other's capabilities sufficiently, they would talk. Because two powers of equal strength fighting to mutual destruction was wasteful, and waste was inefficient, and inefficiency was unacceptable. The Lich King turned his attention to rebuilding the forces he'd expended today. 300 undead destroyed, but thousands more available across territories he'd already claimed. The loss was acceptable. The intelligence gained was invaluable. And far to the south, he knew the skeletal mage was thinking exactly the same calculations. In Clearwater, recorded everything from his concealed position. The massive undead assault. The impossibly powerful guardians defending against overwhelming numbers. The skeletal figure who'd appeared, and in what Ian's mind classified as an act of casual divine intervention, erased 300 animated corpses with 2 spells. His hands shook as he encrypted the transmission. The Cardinals needed this intelligence. The world needed to understand what they were facing. 2 powers, both undead. Both commanded by entities that could reshape battlefields with individual action, and both miraculously had chosen not to annihilate each other despite obvious capability. That terrified him more than the violence had, because it meant they were thinking, planning, operating with strategic patience that suggested long-term objectives. Ian transmitted the data, collapsed his observation post, and began the long withdrawal to theocracy territory. His mission was complete. Whether civilization survived what he'd witnessed was now someone else's problem. The message arrived through undead courier. A single corpse walking through Nazarick's perimeter with the kind of precision that made Albedo's hand drift toward her weapon before she recognized the deliberate nature of its approach. It stopped at exactly the boundary line they had established after Frost Veil Pass. Waited. Made no hostile movement, simply stood there like a messenger who understood protocol. Demiurge examined it from safe distance, magical probes dancing across the corpse's surface. Fascinating. No active threat, no concealed weapons. It's carrying a message. The corpse's jaw worked, and words emerged in a voice that carried no inflection. Not the rasping of dead vocal cords, but pure magical projection, using the body as medium. Continued conflict serves neither interest. Proposed discussion. Frost Veil Pass midpoint. Noon 3 days hence. Lone representatives. The corpse collapsed, animation severed cleanly. Whatever force had controlled it withdrew the instant its message delivered. Albedo turned to Ains, who stood motionless on the throne. "My lord, this could be a trap." Ains's voice carried certainty, or reconnaissance, or genuine negotiation. He paused, and Albedo recognized the hesitation that his guardians interpreted as deep strategic consideration. Demiurge, analysis. "Tactically sound, my lord." Demiurge stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. "Continued warfare depletes both sides' resources. Frost Veil demonstrated mutual capacity for devastating force. Neither party achieved decisive advantage. From game theory perspective, negotiation becomes optimal strategy when victory cost exceeds potential gains." Ains nodded slowly. Albedo watched him process, knowing that beneath the supreme being, facade Suzuki Satoru was probably terrified of making catastrophic mistake. But he'd learned to mask uncertainty behind analytical silence. Threat assessment if we attend moderate to high. Demiurge's honesty was one of his most valuable traits. They could attempt assassination. More likely, they're gathering intelligence on your personal capabilities. But refusing negotiation signals weakness or irrationality, both undesirable from strategic positioning standpoint. And if we refuse? War of attrition, prolonged conflict across territory we've claimed, constant harassment, resource drain, political instability as New World nations choose sides or fragment further. Demiurge's smile was cold. Winnable, certainly, but expensive. Ainz stood from the throne. Prepare response. I'll attend, alone as specified. My lord? Albedo's objection was immediate. Albedo! His tone didn't rise, but authority flooded the chamber. If they wanted me dead, they'd have attempted it at Frostvale when I deployed goal of all life is death. They saw that capability and chose withdrawal over escalation. This entity is strategic. That makes them predictable. He was bluffing. Albedo could tell because she'd learned to read the microscopic tells in his posture. But the logic was sound enough that objecting would seem like questioning his judgment. Understood, my lord. But contingencies, full deployment at perimeter, time stop ready if negotiation fails. Mayor prepares emergency extraction. Cositus holds fallback position. Ainz rattled off preparations that were simultaneously paranoid and sensible. But we proceed as if negotiation is genuine. Because if it is, and we treat it as trap, we lose opportunity for resolution that doesn't cost thousands of undead and territorial stability. Demiurge bowed deeply. Brilliant, my lord. Preparing for treachery while projecting trust. The optimal negotiating posture. Albedo remained silent, watching her creator commit to a course of action that could end in his destruction or save countless resources. She'd follow his orders, she'd prepare every contingency, and she'd pray to whatever forces governed this world that he knew what he was doing. 3 days provided insufficient time for complete preparation, but adequate time for acceptable readiness. The Lich King allocated consciousness to analysis of the coming meeting, while his undead continued infrastructure development across claimed territories. The decision to propose negotiation had been logical. Continued conflict with the southern force, the Sorcerer Kingdom. His intelligence network had finally identified them, would drain resources he needed for broader expansion. The battle at Frostvale had confirmed their combat effectiveness. More importantly, it had confirmed their strategic discipline. That made them viable negotiating partners, entities that thought tactically could be reasoned with, could recognize mutual benefit, could set aside conquest for more efficient resource allocation. The Lich King had built Scourge through understanding when to conquer and when to consolidate. This was consolidation. He manifested at the designated location precisely at noon, the pass midpoint where snow had drifted across frozen corpses from their earlier confrontation, neutral ground stained with evidence of mutual capability. The skeletal mage appeared seconds later, emerging from teleportation circle with a smooth precision that suggested extensive magical infrastructure. No servants, no guards. Exactly as proposed. They stood 30 feet apart. The wind carried no sound except the whisper of snow across ice. The Lich King spoke first, voice projected through magical amplification rather than physical vocal cords. You came. You requested negotiation. The mage's response carried measured caution. I'm prepared to listen. Frostvale demonstrated mutual capacity for destruction. Continued warfare depletes both our forces without guaranteeing victory for either side. Stalemate through attrition benefits no strategic interest. The mage's skeletal fingers tapped once against its staff, a gesture the Lich King catalogued as potential nervous habit. Agreed. What terms do you propose? Direct, efficient. The Lich King approved. Territorial division. Northern territories remain under my control. Your kingdom maintains southern holdings. Boundary established at Frost Vale Pass with buffer zone of 5 miles either side. No incursions, no expansion into claimed territory, no military buildup along border. And if either side violates terms, immediate resumption of hostilities with full force commitment. The Lich King kept his tone neutral. This is not alliance. This is mutual recognition that conquest cost exceeds territorial value. The mage was silent for several seconds. The Lich King waited patient as winter itself. Strategic negotiations required allowing the opponent time to process without pressure. Rushing created defensive reactions. Information sharing. The mage's question surprised him. We're both facing threats beyond each other. The New World nations, for instance, or unknown forces that might emerge as we did. Interesting angle. The entity was thinking beyond immediate conflict toward longer-term strategic stability. That suggested competence beyond simple military capability. Define parameters. Mutual notification of significant threats. Major military movements by third parties. Intelligence on forces that could destabilize regional balance. The mage paused. We don't coordinate. We don't ally. But we avoid being blindsided by shared dangers. The Lich King considered. The proposal had merit. Both their expansions had drawn attention from established powers. Knowing when those powers were mobilizing would provide tactical advantage without requiring cooperation that might create dependencies. Acceptable. With conditions, information shared must be verified. No deliberate misinformation. Violations terminate agreement immediately. Agreed. The mage's response came quickly. Too quickly, or simply recognition of obvious necessity. The Lich King couldn't determine from vocal tone alone. Duration. Indefinite. Either party can terminate with 30 days' notice. Allow strategic repositioning without creating surprise vulnerability. Another pause. Longer this time. The mage was consulting with someone, probably the forces he'd left at perimeter. The Lich King permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The entity was cautious, but not paralyzed by indecision. That suggested organized command structure with clear authority chains. One additional term. The mage's voice carried edge now. Third parties. If the New World nations or other forces attack either of us, the ceasefire holds. We don't assist each other, but we don't exploit the other's engagement to break terms. Smart. Prevented opportunistic backstabbing while maintaining independence. The Lich King had considered the same scenario from his perspective. Acceptable? Then we have agreement. The mage extended one skeletal hand, not for physical contact, but as gesture of formalization. Territorial division at Frost Vale Pass. Information sharing on verified threats. 30-day termination notice. No exploitation of third-party conflicts. The Lich King raised his own hand in mirror gesture. Confirmed. Neither moved to close the distance. Neither offered more extensive diplomatic protocol. The agreement existed through mutual acknowledgement, not friendship or trust. Your forces are competent. The mage's observation carried no flattery. The battle demonstrated organization I haven't encountered in this world. Your capabilities exceeded standard projections. The Lich King returned the assessment. The instant death magic was comprehensive. Goal of all life is death. The name was offered freely, which suggested either confidence or deliberate information sharing. Eclipse class skill. I have others, but that one seemed appropriate for establishing deterrence. The Lich King filed the information. Eclipse class suggested hierarchical skill structure, which suggested game mechanics or similar systemic magic, which aligned with his earlier suspicions about this entity's nature. Helm of Domination. He offered equivalent exchange. Artifact-based telepathic command. I've been adapting it to this world's magical framework. Adaptation required. The local magic operates under different principles. Required recalibration to achieve optimal efficiency. The Lich King saw no reason to conceal tactical information that was already demonstrated. Your transition. Similar challenges. The magic here is flexible in ways I didn't expect, required adjustment. Both entities that didn't originate from this world then. Both working within unfamiliar magical systems. Both powerful enough that adaptation hadn't prevented effective operation. The Lich King reassessed threat probability upward. If this entity had achieved current capability while still learning local magic, full adaptation would make them significantly more dangerous, which reinforced the value of this agreement. We should formalize boundary markers. The mage gestured toward the pass. Physical indication of territorial limits. Prevents accidental violations. Agreed. Stone monuments at mile intervals along the line, marked with both our signatures to confirm mutual establishment. I'll have mine erected within the week. As will I. Silence settled again. The negotiation was complete. Terms established. Mutual recognition achieved. Remaining would serve no purpose except prolonged exposure that neither seemed comfortable with. The Lich King turned first not from dismissal, but from recognition that the meeting had achieved its objective. No reason to extend interaction beyond necessity. One question. The mage's voice stopped him. What do I call you? For maintaining information channels, name Simplify Communication. Practical consideration. The Lich King evaluated what to reveal. His full title carried implications from Azeroth that might not translate meaningfully here, but anonymity would complicate future exchanges. Lich King, the title suffices. Ains Ual Gaun. The response came without hesitation. Sorcerer King of Nazarick. Nazarick. The Lich King filed the name alongside other gathered intelligence. A kingdom, then. Organized infrastructure, not just personal power base. Until circumstances change, Ains Ual Gaun. Until they do, Lich King. Both entities departed. No ceremony, no ritual. The agreement existed through words exchanged and terms accepted. Everything else was unnecessary decoration. Ains materialized in Nazarick's throne room and immediately allowed himself 3 seconds of absolute panic before his emotional suppression kicked in. He'd just negotiated with a potentially world-ending threat. Alone. Based on improvised game theory and desperate hope that projecting confidence would substitute for actual diplomatic expertise. And it had worked. Demiurge was already analyzing the conversation from scrying records. Masterful, my lord. You established territorial security while gathering intelligence on his capabilities and origin. The mutual information sharing creates dependency that benefits us more than him. Our intelligence network is superior, so we provide less value than we receive. Ains nodded as if that had been his plan instead of blind terror making him agree to whatever seemed reasonable. Albedo deploy border monitoring. I want every inch of that boundary line under observation. If he violates terms, I want to know immediately. Aska. Already in progress, my lord. Shall Tyr continue aerial reconnaissance? Now that we have formal agreement, his forces shouldn't engage our scouts. Use that to map his territory in detail. With pleasure. The Guardians moved with practiced efficiency, translating his paranoid impulses into actionable strategy. Ains watched them work and felt the familiar mixture of pride and terror. They believed in him, absolutely. Believed every decision was calculated brilliance instead of desperate improvisation. He couldn't let them discover otherwise. My lord, Demiurge approached with slight bow. If I may observe, you've accomplished in one meeting what would have required months of warfare. You've secured our borders, established intelligence protocols, and demonstrated strength sufficient to negotiate from equality rather than desperation. Truly, your strategic vision continues to astound. I do what's necessary for Nazarick's interests. Ains delivered the line with confidence he didn't feel. Dismissed, all of you. I need to consider next steps. The Guardians departed. Alone in the throne room, Ains allowed himself another moment of honest assessment. He'd just made peace with an undead warlord who commanded armies through telepathic artifact. They'd agreed to not kill each other. They'd established borders like civilized nations instead of competing necromancers. And somehow, impossibly, it had been the right decision. Ains wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more terrified than before. Both, probably. Always both. Far to the south, in the Theocracy headquarters, Cardinal Raymond read Ian Clearwater's latest report 3 times before accepting its contents. The 2 undead powers had negotiated, established territorial boundaries, agreed to ceasefire, which meant they were both rational actors, strategic thinkers, entities that could be reasoned with or manipulated through conventional political means. That should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified him more than mindless undead hordes ever could, because mindless threats could be fought with simple violence. Rational threats required matching their strategic thinking, required understanding their objectives, required treating them as peers instead of monsters. The Theocracy wasn't prepared for that. None of the New World nations were. They'd been operating under the assumption that undead were chaotic evil to be eliminated. Now they faced undead diplomats carving up territory through negotiation. Raymond drafted orders to the other cardinals. Immediate council session. Complete reassessment of strategic doctrine, because the world had just changed in ways their theology didn't account for. And if they didn't adapt faster than their enemies were adapting, the Theocracy wouldn't survive to witness whatever came next. He sealed the orders, dispatched them through priority channels, and allowed himself one moment of honest uncertainty before returning to the mask of confident authority cardinals were required to project. The age of simple moral clarity was ending. The age of complicated strategic calculation had begun. And Raymond suspected history would not be kind to those who couldn't make that transition. Demiurge had been analyzing battlefield residue from Frost Vale Pass for 8 days. The work required precision that most would consider excessive. But precision was the only standard he accepted. Each sample cataloged each magical signature, mapped each anomaly, cross-referenced against Nazarick's extensive arcane databases. Most of what he found aligned with expectations. Undead animation signatures consistent with the Lich King's demonstrated capabilities. Frost magic residue matching the northern entity's territorial expansion patterns. Standard necromantic architecture, albeit executed with competence that suggested expertise rather than raw power. But there was something else. A secondary signature. Faint, buried beneath layers of more obvious magical activity. So subtle that initial scans had missed it entirely. Only his fourth pass analysis using equipment calibrated specifically for residual enchantments had detected the anomaly. Demiurge isolated the signature, subjected it to spectral analysis, compared it against every documented magical tradition in the New World. No matches. He cross-referenced with Yggdrasil's magical frameworks, despite knowing such knowledge shouldn't exist in this realm. Still no matches. The signature didn't correlate to necromancy, despite appearing in areas saturated with undead presence. It didn't match frost magic, though it concentrated most heavily around ice formations. It operated on principles that defied categorization within any magical taxonomy he'd encountered. That disturbed him more than enemy capabilities or territorial disputes ever could. Unknown magic meant unknown threats. Unknown threats meant his strategic models were incomplete. Incomplete models meant failure scenarios he couldn't predict. Unacceptable. He prepared his findings, organized them with the meticulous structure Lord Ains had come to expect, and requested emergency council session. Ains studied the spectral analysis displays floating above the round table. Colors and patterns that meant absolutely nothing to him danced across charts he desperately hoped he could interpret correctly. Demiurge's explanation had been thorough, technical, and terrifying in its implications. "So you're saying..." Ains kept his voice level, projecting the authority that made his guardians believe he understood everything. "There's a third magical presence at Frostvale. Something neither we nor the Lich King deployed." "Correct, my lord." Demiurge gestured to the readouts. "The signature is consistent across multiple sample sites. Not random contamination, but deliberate magical activity occurring simultaneously with the battle. As if something else was observing." Albedo leaned forward, golden eyes narrowing. "The theocracy. Their spy networks are sophisticated." "Negative." Demiurge dismissed the suggestion with clinical certainty. "Theocracy magic leaves distinct divine resonance. This signature contains no holy element whatsoever. Furthermore, the concentration points are wrong for surveillance magic. They cluster around geological features, ice formations, deep permafrost, ancient rock strata." Shaltir tilted her head, blood-red eyes gleaming with interest she rarely showed for strategic discussions. "You're saying the ground itself is magical?" "I'm saying something beneath the ground is radiating power we can't identify." Demiurge's correction was gentle. "The battle may have disturbed it. Or our presence combined with the Lich King's forces created resonance that activated dormant enchantments." Ains felt his anxiety spike, immediately suppressed by undead emotional regulation. This was exactly the kind of scenario that kept him awake metaphorically, since he no longer required sleep at night. Unknown magical forces, potential world-ending threats, situations that required expertise he didn't possess, but he couldn't show uncertainty. The Guardians needed confidence, needed to believe their supreme being had already anticipated this possibility and was merely gathering data before revealing his master plan. "Recommendations." He directed the question to Demiurge, buying himself time to think. "Immediate reconnaissance. Deep Earth scrying focused on Frostvale region. Mare is most qualified. His Earth manipulation provides natural affinity for subsurface magical detection." Demiurge's fingers traced patterns across the display. "We need to understand what we're dealing with before it becomes active threat. And if it's already active, then we determine if it poses greater danger than the Lich King. If so..." Demiurge paused and Ains recognized the hesitation that meant his strategist was proposing something he expected resistance to. We might need to share intelligence with our northern neighbor. The suggestion hung in the chamber's silence. Albedo's expression darkened. Shaltir looked confused. Cositis remained still as ice processing the implications. Ains made himself nod slowly, as if he'd already considered and accepted this possibility. Explain your reasoning. If this unknown force threatens both our territories, continued conflict with the Lich King depletes resources we might need for mutual defense. The ceasefire already establishes framework for information sharing. This would be logical application of existing agreement. Professional, rational, absolutely correct if the threat proved significant enough. And utterly terrifying because it meant Ains might have to coordinate with another entity who commanded world-ending power. Approved. But we verify the threat's nature before initiating contact. I won't expose our intelligence capabilities based on preliminary analysis. Ains delivered the order with finality. Mare begin deep Earth reconnaissance immediately. Demiurge continue analysis. Albedo increase monitoring along the northern border. If this anomaly activates, I want early warning. The Guardians saluted and dispersed. Ains remained seated, skeletal fingers motionless against obsidian. He'd just made decisions that could either save Nazarick or expose them to threats he couldn't comprehend. Standard operating procedure, really. He was getting distressingly good at that. Ian Clearwater had been underground for 6 hours. The tunnel network beneath Frost Veil Pass extended deeper than surface geography suggested possible. Ice formations gave way to ancient stone, carved with patterns that predated any known civilization. The magical signature down here made his detection spells scream warnings. He'd exceeded his mission parameters 3 hours ago. The Cardinals had authorized surface reconnaissance intelligence gathering on the ceasefire between the two undead powers. They hadn't authorized deep penetration into unknown hostile territory. But what he'd discovered required investigation. The runes covering these walls didn't match anything in theocracy archives. They weren't derived from known magical traditions. They operated on principles that felt wrong, not evil, not chaotic, just fundamentally incompatible with standard enchantment architecture. And they were active. Not dormant historical artifacts, but functioning magical constructs, channeling power from sources he couldn't identify. Ian photographed another section of wall, his hand steady despite the cold that had nothing to do with temperature. This deep magic itself felt different, heavier, like the world's normal rules didn't quite apply. A sound echoed through the tunnel. Not footsteps, not wind. Something that resembled breathing but came from the wrong direction from below, from the rock itself. He froze, every survival instinct screaming at him to retreat. But he'd come this far. The intelligence value was too high to abandon based on ambient noise. Ian advanced another 50 feet, following the rune patterns deeper. The tunnel opened into a cavern that violated geological possibility. The space was too large, too regular. Clearly artificial construction, but the scale suggested civilization with resources no known nation possessed. At the cavern's center, suspended in ice that radiated power like a miniature sun, something waited. Ian's breath caught. It wasn't human, wasn't undead, wasn't anything he had taxonomic category for. The creature's form was massive, 20 feet tall at minimum, and vaguely humanoid. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the body too segmented. Like something designed by an intelligence that understood anatomy but didn't share baseline assumptions about how bodies should function. And it was aware. Ian couldn't see eyes through the ice, but he felt attention focus on him with the weight of predatory interest. The creature didn't move, couldn't move trapped in whatever enchantment bound it. But it knew he was there. The runes along the cavern walls pulsed brighter. The breathing sound intensified. Ice began to crack. Ian made a decision based purely on survival instinct. He ran. The tunnel behind him filled with sound. Cracking ice, shifting stone, something massive straining against ancient bindings. He didn't look back. Didn't try to gather more intelligence. Survival had become the only objective. He emerged from the tunnels into frozen night, activated his emergency teleportation crystal, and fled to the coordinates he'd pre-established for extraction. The spell deposited him in safe territory 300 miles south. He collapsed against frozen stone lungs burning from exertion his training should have prepared him to handle easily. But his hands were shaking, because he'd just discovered something that made two undead superpowers seem manageable by comparison. Something ancient, something imprisoned, something that had noticed him, and something that was waking up. The Lich King felt the disturbance through his network, not a direct assault, but a ripple in the magical substrate beneath his claimed territory. Power spiking from depths he hadn't explored because surface conquest had taken priority. He allocated consciousness to investigation, sending awareness downward through permafrost and bedrock. The psychic network extended poorly through solid matter, but he could sense enough. Ancient magic, different from the necromancy he wielded, different from the artifact power of the helm, different from anything he'd encountered in this world. And it was resonating with something. Not his forces, not the southern entity's magic. Something deeper, older. The helm provided information through channels that bypassed conventional perception. He saw patterns in the magical resonance, saw how they connected to ice formations across his territory, saw how they'd been dormant until recent magical activity. The battle at Frostvale most likely had triggered awakening. Threat assessment currently contained, but potentially catastrophic if fully activated. Strategic priority reassessment, understanding this phenomenon, exceeded value of territorial expansion. The Lich King withdrew most of his consciousness from surface operations, focused it on the subsurface anomaly. He would map it, understand it, determine if it posed threat that required action. And if it did, the ceasefire with the southern entity suddenly became more valuable. Because if this unknown force emerged, having another competent power as potential ally rather than definite enemy would shift tactical calculations significantly. He didn't like depending on others, but he liked uncontrolled variables threatening his infrastructure even less. The Lich King began systematic analysis of the deep earth magical signatures. Whatever was down there had remained dormant for long enough to be forgotten by surface civilizations. That suggested either extreme age or deliberate concealment. Both possibilities concerned him. He continued his investigation patient and methodical, understanding first. Response second. The dead could wait. They were very good at waiting. But whatever slept beneath the ice might not wait much longer. In Nazarick's laboratory complex, Mare completed the first deep earth scan and stared at the results with growing unease. The magical signature Demiurge had identified wasn't isolated to Frostvale. It extended across hundreds of miles, forming a network that connected subsurface chambers in geometric patterns no natural geological process would create. And at the network's center, buried beneath layers of permafrost and ancient stone, something massive was generating power on a scale that rivaled Nazarick's strongest defensive enchantments. Mare transmitted the findings to Lord Ains, hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts at composure. Because what he'd discovered suggested they weren't dealing with residual magic or dormant artifacts. They were dealing with infrastructure, a system, built by something that understood magical engineering at a level that matched or exceeded Yggdrasil's greatest achievements. And it was waking up. Cardinal Raymond read Ian Clearwater's emergency report 3 times before accepting its contents. Ancient ruins beneath Frostvale Pass. Rune systems operating on unknown magical principles. A creature imprisoned in ice that had demonstrated awareness despite its binding. All of it located directly between the 2 undead powers who just established territorial ceasefire. Raymond's tactical mind processed implications immediately. If this ancient threat emerged, it would attack whichever power occupied the territory above it, which meant both undead forces would respond, which meant the ceasefire might hold or might collapse depending on how they interpreted the threat, or more concerning possibility, they might coordinate against the common danger. 2 undead superpowers working together would be catastrophic for the theocracy's long-term strategic position. But an ancient threat powerful enough to concern both undead powers would be equally catastrophic if left unaddressed. Raymond drafted orders. Maximum intelligence priority on the subsurface anomaly. Deploy additional field operatives to map the extent of whatever was down there. Prepare contingency plans for multiple scenarios. And most importantly, determine if the theocracy could somehow use this threat to its advantage, either by eliminating it themselves and gaining political capital, or by ensuring it emerged in ways that would fragment the undead powers rather than unite them. Cold calculation. Strategic manipulation. Everything his faith claimed to oppose. But survival sometimes required compromise with principles. Raymond sealed the orders and dispatched them through encrypted channels. The world was about to get more complicated, and the theocracy needed to ensure it remained relevant when the dust settled. The second message arrived through the same method as the first. Undead courier, precise delivery to boundary line, magical projection containing words that carried no emotion. Subsurface anomaly confirmed. Mutual threat assessment required. Same location. Tomorrow. Ains read the message 3 times before summoning his guardians. The Lich King had discovered the same threat independently, which meant it was significant enough to overcome the northern entity's demonstrated preference for isolation. That made it terrifying. He's asking for coordination. Albedo's tone carried distaste barely concealed by professional neutrality. Not cooperation. Coordination. He wants to share intelligence on a threat neither of us can address alone. Demiurge studied the projected message fingers, steepled in that way that meant he was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously. Logical. If our analysis is correct about the subsurface entity's scale, neither Nazarick nor the Lich King's forces possess complete data. Pooling intelligence increases both parties' survival probability and reveals our capabilities to a potential enemy. Shalter's objection was immediate. We'd be showing him our reconnaissance methods, our analytical frameworks, maybe even our response strategies. He'd be revealing equivalent information. Ains kept his voice measured, despite the anxiety his emotional suppression was working overtime to contain. Mutual vulnerability creates mutual incentive for honesty. Neither party benefits from providing false intelligence when we're facing genuine threat. The logic was sound. He knew it was sound because Demiurge was nodding with that expression that meant he was about to compliment Ains's strategic brilliance. But the fear remained. What if this was elaborate manipulation? What if the Lich King was using fabricated threat to gather intelligence on Nazarick's full capabilities? What if Ains made the wrong call and got everyone killed? Prepare intelligence packages. He delivered the order before doubt could paralyze him. Verify data only. Subsurface magical signatures. Geological analysis, threat assessment models. Nothing that reveals Nazarick's internal structure or guardian capabilities. We share what's necessary to address the immediate danger, nothing more. And if he requests more detailed information, Albedo's question was pointed. We negotiate. This isn't alliance, it's transaction. We trade information at equivalent value. He wants our deep Earth scrying data. He provides his network's subsurface observations. Even exchange verified accuracy, no long-term commitments. Demiurge smiled. Perfect transactional framework, my lord. You've structured this to maximize our intelligence gain, while minimizing exploitation vulnerability. Brilliant as always. Ainz accepted the praise with a nod that masked his internal screaming. He was making this up as he went translating corporate merger logic into magical superpower diplomacy, and somehow it kept working because his subordinates were competent enough to execute brilliance from his improvisation. I'll attend alone. Again. He stood from the throne. Albedo, same contingency deployment as last time. If this goes badly, I want immediate extraction capability. Understood, my lord. The Guardians departed to prepare. Ainz remained motionless, wondering if he'd just made the decision that would save Nazarick or doom it. Standard operating procedure. The Lich King manifested at the meeting point precisely on schedule. The skeletal mage, Ainz Ual Gown, appeared seconds later. Teleportation circle dissipating into residual magic that the Lich King cataloged automatically. Neither wasted time on diplomatic pleasantries. You found it. The Lich King's statement wasn't a question. Mare detected subsurface network extending hundreds of miles. Geometric chamber configuration suggesting deliberate construction. Central power source rivaling our strongest defensive enchantments. Ainz's response was clinical. Helm network mapped similar architecture. Ancient rune systems operating on principles that don't match local magical frameworks. Something imprisoned beneath Frost Veil region. Possibly aware. Definitely activating. The Lich King paused. Your intelligence suggests scale exceeds individual engagement capability. Agreed. This requires coordinated response or neither of us survives the emergence. The admission hung between them. Two entities who'd fought to stalemate, acknowledging mutual inadequacy against common threat. It violated every principle of strategic posturing, but survival superseded pride. Information exchange parameters. The Lich King kept his tone neutral. Equivalent value, verified accuracy. No internal capability reveals beyond what's necessary for tactical coordination. Ainz gestured and magical displays materialized, showing Mare's deep earth scans. This is what we've mapped. Subsurface chamber network power concentration points, activation indicators. What do you have? The Lich King manifested his own displays. Helm network data showing psychic resonance patterns, ice formation correlations, magical signature analysis that complemented Nazarick's geological approach. Two different methodologies converging on the same conclusion. Something massive was waking up beneath their territories. They compared data in silence, each analyzing what the other revealed while searching for deception or manipulation. The Lich King found none. Ainz's intelligence matched his own observations too precisely to be fabricated, which meant either the threat was genuine or the southern entity was sophisticated enough to create false data that perfectly aligned with independent verification. The former seemed more likely. Creating that level of deception would require resources better spent on direct conquest. Combined analysis. Ains's question interrupted the Lich King's tactical assessment. The entity is contained, but containment is failing. Recent magical activity, our battle at Frost Vale, most likely triggered acceleration of awakening process. Current projection, full emergence within 2 to 4 weeks. Mayor's calculations suggest 3 weeks. Your timeline aligns. Ains's skeletal fingers tapped against his staff. Threat assessment. Unknown. Insufficient data on the entity's capabilities, objectives, or nature. We know it's old. We know it was deliberately imprisoned. We know whoever imprisoned it possessed magical engineering exceeding modern capabilities, which suggests the entity required that level of effort to contain. Ains completed the logic. Something powerful enough that ancient civilization with superior magic couldn't simply destroy it. Both entities processed the implication. They were dealing with threat that had required imprisonment rather than elimination by forces more advanced than either of them. Response options. The Lich King kept his tone clinical, despite the concerning strategic assessment. Immediate deep reconnaissance to gather more intelligence. Secondary, prepare containment reinforcement to delay emergence while we develop counter-strategies. Tertiary, if containment fails, coordinated engagement to eliminate threat before it achieves full power. Ains paused. None of these are optimal. All carry significant risk. But doing nothing guarantees catastrophic outcome when it emerges uncontrolled. Agreed. The Lich King made his decision based on pure strategic calculation. Proposed division of effort. I'll handle subsurface reconnaissance. Helm network provides advantage for deep earth psychic mapping. You coordinate containment reinforcement. Your magical infrastructure exceeds mine for large-scale enchantment work. And when we have complete intelligence, we determine if elimination is feasible. If not, the Lich King let the sentence hang. We consider other options. Neither wanted to voice the possibility that they might be facing something neither could defeat, but both understood the implication. One additional consideration. Ains's tone shifted slightly. The New World nations. They're already destabilized by our presence. If this entity emerges, it threatens them as much as us. Irrelevant to our survival. Relevant to post-emergent strategic positioning. Ains's counter was immediate. If we eliminate the threat those nations owe us, if we fail and retreat, they provide buffer between us and whatever emerges. Either scenario, keeping them functional serves our interests. The Lich King reassessed. He'd been thinking purely in terms of immediate tactical response. The skeletal mage was considering long-term political ramifications. Both perspectives had merit. Proposed notification to major powers limited intelligence sharing to prevent panic while ensuring they don't accidentally interfere. Notification, yes. Minimal detail. Presented as us addressing mutual threat to regional stability. They don't need to know the full scope, just enough to keep them from making situation worse through ignorant action. Strategic manipulation disguised as cooperation. The Lich King approved of the efficiency. Acceptable. You handle diplomatic notification. Your kingdom has more established relationships with local powers. I'll begin deep reconnaissance immediately. Timeline for next intelligence exchange. 72 hours, same location. We share findings and adjust strategy accordingly. Ains extended his hand in the same gesture from their previous negotiation. The Lich King mirrored it. Not friendship, not even alliance in traditional sense. Just two rational entities acknowledging that survival required temporary coordination. Until the threat is addressed Ans Uol Gaun, until it is Lich King. Both entities departed. Neither trusted the other, but both understood that trust wasn't required when mutual self-interest aligned sufficiently. Cardinal Raymond received Nazarick's diplomatic communique with the kind of dread that came from recognizing checkmate 3 moves before it arrived. The message was professionally vague. Significant subsurface anomaly beneath northern territories. Sorcerer Kingdom and Northern Forces coordinating investigation. Recommend civilian withdrawal from buffer zones pending threat assessment. Details available upon request to verify diplomatic channels. No demands. No threats. Just notification. As if the 2 undead powers were public utilities warning about infrastructure issues. Raymond convened emergency council session within the hour. They're coordinating. Berenice's statement carried weight. Not just ceasefire, active cooperation on shared threat. This changes everything. What threat? Dominic's skepticism was reflexive. We have one field report from Clearwater about something under the ice. That's insufficient basis for accepting undead diplomatic outreach at face value. Clearwater is our best operative. If he ran from something, it merits investigation. Raymond's tone cut through the debate. More importantly, 2 powers who fought to mutual exhaustion 3 weeks ago are now sharing intelligence. Either the threat is genuine or we're witnessing sophisticated deception beyond anything we've encountered. Yvon cleared his throat. Military perspective, if they're being honest about coordinated response. We should position forces to exploit any opening their distraction creates. If they're deceiving us, we need containment strategies for expanded undead cooperation. And if the threat is real, and we're ignoring it while planning opportunistic strikes. Berenice's question was pointed. We could find ourselves fighting something that required 2 undead superpowers to coordinate against. Silence settled over the council chamber. Raymond made his decision based on incomplete information and calculated risk standard procedure for anyone leading organizations during existential crises. We respond on 3 tracks. First, accept their offer for detailed briefing through diplomatic channels. We gather intelligence on what they claim to be facing. Second, deploy our own reconnaissance to verify their claims independently. I want the confirmation before we commit resources. Third, prepare for multiple scenarios, including genuine threat, undead cooperation, and potential deception. The cardinals nodded. Professional agreement masking fundamental uncertainty about which scenario they were actually facing. One additional consideration. Raymond looked to each cardinal. If this threat is genuine, and if it emerges despite their coordination, we may need to consider active cooperation with the undead powers. Dominic's objection was immediate. The theocracy cannot ally with... I said consider, not commit. Raymond's interruption was firm. Our doctrine opposes undead. Our survival requires pragmatism. If the choice becomes cooperation with undead or annihilation by worst threat, we choose survival and address theological implications afterward. The logic was cold, cynical, completely contrary to everything the theocracy claimed to represent, and absolutely necessary. Prepare diplomatic response accepting their briefing offer. I want our best analysts present, and I want Clearwater extracted from the field. His direct experience with the subsurface entity makes him invaluable for verification. Orders dispatched. Contingencies planned. Faith-based organization adapting to reality that didn't align with comfortable theological certainties. Raymond returned to his private chambers and allowed himself one moment of honest assessment. The world was forcing him to choose between principles and survival, between doctrine that claimed moral authority and pragmatism that might actually preserve his civilization. He'd choose survival, every time, and he'd pray for forgiveness later if there was a later to pray in. The minor kingdoms received Nazarick's notification through various channels. Most panicked. Some saw opportunity. A few actually thought strategically. The Riestai's kingdom fortified borders and recalled armies from extended deployments. The Baharuth Empire increased intelligence operations while publicly maintaining neutral diplomatic stance. Smaller nations scrambled to form defensive pacts or sought protection from larger powers. None of them understood the true scale of what was waking beneath the northern ice. But they all recognized that when two undead superpowers stopped fighting each other to coordinate against common threat, survival required paying attention. Alliances formed, not through shared values or diplomatic tradition, but through naked self-interest and mutual fear. The New World's political landscape was reorganizing itself around the simple recognition that something worse than undead kingdoms was emerging. And if they wanted to survive what came next, old enmities and comfortable certainties would need to be reconsidered. Far beneath the frozen wastes and chambers carved by civilizations that predated recorded history, something ancient stirred. The bindings that had held it for millennia were cracking, not from age, but from the resonance of powerful magic deployed above. The battle at Frostvale Pass, the teleportation circles, the massive necromantic networks, and world-class enchantments. All of it had fed power into systems designed to remain dormant. And dormancy was ending. The entity didn't think in ways that translated to mortal consciousness. It didn't have objectives in any understandable sense. It simply was a force of nature given form, ancient beyond measure, powerful beyond conventional categorization. And it was waking. The ice above groaned. Rock shifted. Runes that had glowed dimly for thousands of years began to pulse with intensity that suggested imminent failure. 3 weeks, perhaps less. Then containment would shatter, and the new world would discover what civilizations long forgotten had been desperate enough to imprison rather than destroy. The ice shattered at dawn on the 18th day. Not gradually. Not with warning tremors that might have allowed final preparations. The containment failed catastrophically, releasing pressure that had been building for 3 weeks across a magical infrastructure older than recorded history. Mare's monitoring stations detected the breach 6 seconds before the shockwave hit. 6 seconds to transmit alert to Nazarick. 6 seconds for the Lich King's network to register catastrophic disruption across his northern territory. Not enough time to stop what came next. The entity emerged from chambers that had been its prison for millennia. It didn't think in ways that translated to conscious intent. It simply existed ancient force, given terrible form power, concentrated into physical manifestation that violated comfortable assumptions about how reality should function. 20 feet tall, vaguely humanoid, proportions wrong in ways that suggested alien design philosophy. Limbs too long, body too segmented, movements fluid in directions anatomy shouldn't permit. And power. Raw, undiluted magical force radiating from every surface with intensity that made the air crystallize and ground crack. The Devourer scholars would name it later. Those few who survived to write accounts rose from its prison and assessed the world above with senses that operated beyond mortal comprehension. It detected life, magic, organized consciousness. It moved toward concentration of both. Hines received Mare's alert and made instant decisions based on pure crisis protocol. Full Guardian deployment, immediate teleportation to Frost Vale region. Combat formation Alpha 7. The Guardians moved with practiced efficiency. No questions, no hesitation. Centuries of loyalty channeled into disciplined response. Albedo materialized armor and weapon. Shalter's Spewit lance appeared in her hands. Cositus's ice blades formed from ambient moisture. Aura and Mare prepared battlefield control spells. Demiurge coordinated logistics while simultaneously analyzing threat vectors. My Lord, preliminary readings suggest power output exceeding our most conservative estimates. This entity registers at world enemy tier. Ainz felt his anxiety spike, immediately suppressed. World enemy. Yggdrasil terminology for threats that required raid-level coordination to defeat. Boss encounters designed for 40 players working in perfect synchronization. He had 8 guardians and himself, and one very uncertain alliance with another undead superpower. Transmit coordinates to the Lich King. Full intelligence package. If we're doing this, we do it together, or not at all. Already done, my lord. Demiurge's efficiency was terrifying and comforting simultaneously. Teleportation circles activated. Nazarick's full combat strength deployed to battlefield before most of the New World nations even understood what had emerged. The Lich King felt containment breach through his network like psychic shockwave. Undead across his territory stumbled as the mental connection destabilized. Not severed, his control remained, but disrupted by power that operated on frequencies his helm couldn't fully filter. Through scattered consciousness, he observed the entity, assessed capabilities, calculated threat priority, catastrophic. His undead forces were numerous, but fragile against concentrated power. The entity could destroy hundreds with casual effort, thousands if given time, his entire infrastructure if left unchecked. Ainz's intelligence package arrived seconds later. Devourer designation, world enemy tier, coordinated engagement recommended. The Lich King allocated forces immediately. 3,000 undead to harassment and distraction. Valkyr wings for aerial assault. His personal intervention for concentrated damage where opportunity presented. And communication link to the southern entity because pride was less important than survival. Acknowledged. Committing full available forces. Recommend division of engagement vectors your elite units handle direct assault. My numbers provide pressure and positioning. The response came instantly. Agreed. Albedo coordinates Guardian deployment. You handle battlefield control. We converge on targets simultaneously. Professional, efficient. 2 commanders who'd fought each other 3 weeks ago now coordinating like they'd trained together for years. Because the alternative was mutual annihilation. The Devourer moved across frozen landscape and reality bent around it. Ice melted, then refroze in geometric patterns. Ground cracked along fault lines that followed mathematical precision rather than geological stress. The air itself warped, creating visual distortions like heat shimmer over desert sand. It detected organized resistance approaching, analyzed threat potential. Found it. Interesting. Small entities, individually weak, but coordinated, operating under unified strategic framework, similar to what the ancient civilization had deployed before its imprisonment. The Devourer had destroyed that civilization. Given time, it would destroy this one. But time was what the defenders were trying to deny it. Albedo hit first. Teleportation deposited her 30 feet from the Devourer's position. World-class armor deflecting the ambient magical distortion that would have killed lesser beings. Her weapon struck with force that could shatter castle walls. The devourer caught the blow with one elongated limb. No impact, no resistance. The kinetic energy simply stopped. Absorbed into whatever physics the entity operated under. Albedo withdrew before counterattack could land, already signaling tactical adjustment. Physical strikes ineffective, switching to magical assault. Shaltir descended from above Spewit Lance, channeling blood magic that had devastated armies. The attack connected first successful damage. The devourer's form, rippled substance disrupted by magic that operated on life force rather than physical principles. But it adapted. The second strike met resistance. The third bounced harmlessly. Learning our attack patterns. Shaltir's observation carried edge. It's reading our magic and developing counters in real time. Cositis engaged from the flank. Ice magic that could freeze oceans poured across the devourer's form. It slowed. Actually slowed. Movements becoming sluggish as temperature dropped beyond what living biology could withstand. Mare followed immediately, earth magic reshaping terrain beneath the entity, destabilizing its footing, creating sinkholes that pulled it down. The devourer erupted. Power blast that shattered Mare's constructs and sent Cositis sliding backward across ice. Not defeated, not even significantly damaged. Just annoyed. And the Lich King's forces struck from 3 vectors simultaneously. Undead waves crashed against the entity, each corpse expendable, each attack buying seconds for the elite units to position. Valkyr darted through the chaos, frost magic, and necromantic assault, combining in patterns that forced the devourer to divide attention. It destroyed them by dozens. They kept coming. The Lich King himself manifested on the battlefield's edge. Frost-morn-drawn helm pulsing with power as he channeled domination magic, not at the entity that would be futile, but at the environment around it. Ice obeyed. Rock answered. The terrain itself became weapon constraining the devourer's movement, limiting its tactical options, creating openings for Nazarick's guardians to exploit. Ains appeared in a flash of teleportation. Staff-raised spell already forming. Not goal of all life is death that wouldn't work on something this alien. Instead, he deployed crowd control magic, time manipulation, gravity wells, environmental effects that didn't require understanding the target's biology. The devourer slowed under combined magical assault, not stopped, not trapped, but constrained enough that coordinated strikes could land. Albedo Shaltir Cositis converge. Ains's command cut through battlefield chaos. Lich King collapsed terrain on my mark. 3, 2. The Lich King didn't wait for one. He recognized opportunity when tactics aligned. The ground beneath the devourer fractured ice formations, driving upward like spears, undead forces surging from collapsed tunnels. The Guardians struck simultaneously. 3 world-class entities hitting with combined force that would have leveled cities. The devourer shattered. For exactly 2 seconds. Then, it reformed. Substance coalescing from dispersed energy form, reconstructing faster than they could disrupt it. And it was learning. Each attack pattern cataloged, each weakness exploited, each second making it more dangerous. It's not alive. Demiurge's voice transmitted through communication spell. Traditional destruction won't work. We need containment. Seal it like the original civilization did. With what? Ains felt panic rising. We don't have their infrastructure. We don't have their magic. We barely understand how they imprisoned it in the first place. Then we improvise. The Lich King's response carried cold certainty. Your guardian, the one who manipulates Earth. He can reach the original binding chambers. If containment architecture still exists, we reinforce it. Force the entity back into prison it broke free from. Mare's voice shaking slightly. I can try, Lord Ains. But I'll need time, and the entity won't let me work unmolested. Then we give you time. Albedo's declaration brooked no argument. All of us. Whatever it takes. What followed was violence measured not in casualties, but in seconds purchased. The Guardians fought with desperate precision. The Lich King's forces died in waves that bought mere fractions of minutes to work. Shaltir traded blood magic for injuries that would have killed her if her regeneration wasn't supernatural. Cocytus held positions that should have been overrun. Aura's beasts threw themselves at the entity with loyalty that transcended survival instinct. The Lich King channeled helm power until his consciousness frayed at edges. Undead burned out by hundreds. Valkyr fell like broken birds. He gave ground slowly, buying Mare the time measured in undead corpses and magical exhaustion. Ains deployed spell after spell, draining mana reserves he'd carefully hoarded, throwing power at the entity with calculated desperation. Every second Mare worked was a second they weren't losing. Every second the Devourer was contained was a second closer to victory. Mare dug deep, literally. His earth magic reached through permafrost and bedrock, finding the ancient chambers, feeling the residual enchantments, understanding through pure intuitive connection what the original builders had created. A prison. Not to destroy, but to contain. Magic woven into geology itself, using the planet's structure as binding medium. And it was still there. Damaged. Failing. But there. Mare poured power into the ancient runes, fed them his magic, his will, his absolute belief that Lord Ains's faith in him was justified. The architecture responded, slowly, painfully, but it responded. The Devourer felt the bindings reform, recognized the pattern. The same prison that had held it before now, reinitializing drawing power from the desperate defenders above. It surged, attempting to break free before containment completed. Albedo intercepted. Took damage that cracked her armor. Held position anyway. The Lich King threw undead into its path. Lost connection to hundreds as the entity's power shattered their animation. Maintained the blockade. Ains deployed time stop. Bought 3 frozen seconds for Mare to complete the final connections. The entity broke through, reached Mare's position, raised power to destroy the Guardian who threatened its freedom. Cocytus appeared between them, took the hit that would have obliterated Mare. His form shattered ice and chitin fragments spreading across frozen ground. Mare screamed and poured everything he had into the spell. The ancient binding activated. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The Devourer felt reality shift, felt the prison reassert its claim, felt itself being pulled down back into chambers it had escaped from. It fought. Power radiating outward with force that cracked mountains and boiled ice into steam. But the binding held, inch by inch, second by second. The entity was dragged back into containment. When it was done, silence settled over the battlefield. The kind of quiet that followed catastrophic violence. The kind where survivors took inventory and understood how close they'd come to annihilation. Ein stood among scattered Guardian positions, looking at Cocytus's shattered form. His emotional suppression kept the panic manageable, but the loss cut deeper than he'd expected. The Lich King manifested nearby, His armor showed damage. His forces had been decimated. But he was standing. Cocytus sacrificed himself. Ainz's voice was flat. To save Mare. To complete the binding. Honorable. The Lich King's response carried weight. He died, ensuring victory. His sacrifice prevented catastrophic failure. Can he be resurrected? Unknown. His nature as guardian complicates standard revival protocols. But the Lich King paused. I possess knowledge of resurrection magic. If you're willing to share your guardian's fundamental architecture, I may identify compatible restoration methods. Ainz processed the offer. The Lich King was proposing cooperation that extended beyond immediate crisis, offering expertise that might restore what had been lost. Trust wasn't required. Mutual benefit was. We discussed terms after we've secured the site. The binding won't hold forever. We need permanent solution. Agreed. The Lich King gestured to the crater where Mare had worked. The ancient civilization understood something we don't. We should learn it. Together, preferably. Albedo approached, armor-rent, weapon damaged, but eyes still sharp. My lord? The entity is contained. But Cocytus, can we? We'll find a way. Ainz delivered the promise before certainty could undermine it. Whatever it takes. He earned that. The Lich King nodded. Send your Earth manipulator to coordinate with my network. We'll map the full binding system. Understand it. Strengthen it. And ensure this doesn't happen again. Professional cooperation. No dramatic declarations. Just two leaders recognizing that some threats required setting aside competition for shared survival. Sometime 3 days later, Cardinal Raymond received reports from multiple sources. The Northern Territories had erupted in magical violence. An entity of unknown origin had emerged. Two undead powers had coordinated to suppress it. And somehow, impossibly, they'd succeeded. Which meant the world had just witnessed undead cooperation at scale. Had seen them protect New World territories by addressing threat neither caused. Had watched them act like stabilizing forces. Raymond drafted his assessment, shared it with the Cardinal Council, watched their faces as they processed implications. The age of simple moral certainty was definitely over. The age of complicated strategic calculation had fully arrived. And whether they liked it or not, the theocracy would need to adapt or become irrelevant. He sealed the report, filed it, and prepared for a future that looked nothing like the past. Because the world had changed, and only those who changed with it would survive what came next. The Reconstruction took 14 days. Mare worked alongside the Lich King's network, mapping ancient binding architecture with precision that bordered on obsession. He'd lost Cocytus, failed to protect someone who'd protected him. The only way forward was ensuring that sacrifice meant something. The Lich King provided psychic mapping that complemented Mare's geological sense. Between them, they traced the full extent of what the ancient civilization had built, a prison woven into the planet's structure itself, using principles neither fully understood, but both could reinforce. They didn't speak much. Didn't need to. The work communicated everything necessary. By the 10th day, Mare understood the binding well enough to strengthen it. By the 14th, the reinforcement was complete. Not permanent. Nothing involving that much power could be truly permanent, but stable. Measured in decades rather than weeks. The devourer would remain contained. For now. Ainz stood in Nazarick's resurrection chamber, watching specialists work on Cocytus's remains. The Lich King had provided theoretical frameworks. Demiurge had adapted them to Guardian physiology. Albedo coordinated resources. It might work. Or it might fail catastrophically. Either way, they were trying, because Cocytus had earned that much. "My lord?" Albedo's voice interrupted his observation. "The Lich King requests communication, private channel." Ains nodded, stepping away from the resurrection work. A projection materialized the northern entity's armored form rendered in magical construct. Status. The Lich King's question was direct. Resurrection attempt in progress. Success probability uncertain. Ains kept his response equally clinical. Mayor reports binding reinforcement complete. Your assessment. Stable within acceptable parameters. The entity remains contained. Monitoring stations detect no degradation in structural integrity. A pause. Your Guardian performed admirably. His work may have prevented secondary emergence. He had help. Ains allowed the acknowledgement. Your network's psychic mapping was essential. We couldn't have done it separately. No. The simple agreement carried weight. Neither of us could have addressed this threat alone. That remains relevant. Ains understood the implication. The crisis had passed, but the lesson remained: some threats required coordination that transcended competitive interests. The binding won't hold forever, he said. Eventually we'll need permanent solution. Agreed. Propose continued collaboration on analysis. Your specialists study the magical architecture, mind map psychic resonance patterns. We share findings and develop long-term containment strategy. Professional, practical. No pretense of friendship, but clear recognition that mutual benefit justified ongoing cooperation. Acceptable. Information exchange continues under existing protocols. We meet quarterly to assess binding stability and coordinate response to degradation. One additional matter. The Lich King's tone shifted slightly. If your Guardian's resurrection succeeds, inform me. I would acknowledge his contribution appropriately. Ains felt something that his emotional suppression couldn't quite eliminate. Respect, maybe. Recognition that the northern entity valued competence and sacrifice even from those who'd fought against him weeks ago. I'll inform you, he paused. And if you require Nazarick's assistance with infrastructure reconstruction from the battle, we can discuss terms. Appreciated. My forces sustained significant losses. Rebuilding will require time. The projection wavered slightly. This collaboration, it's efficient. It is. Then we continue it. Until circumstances change. Until they do. The connection terminated. Ains stood alone in the chamber processing what had just occurred. He'd entered into semi-permanent cooperation with an entity he'd been preparing to war against a month ago. And it was probably the correct strategic decision. Demiurge would be proud, or claim he'd anticipated it all along. Either way, Nazarick was more secure with the Lich King as reluctant partner than active enemy. Ains returned to the resurrection chamber, watched the specialists work, and allowed himself cautious hope that Cocytus might return, because even undead overlords could value loyalty. The Lich King withdrew to the frozen throne shard, allocating consciousness to analysis of recent events. He'd coordinated with another power, shared intelligence, fought alongside forces that weren't his own. All actions that contradicted his long-established preference for absolute control. And it had been effective. The Devourer had required combined response. Future threats might demand similar cooperation. Maintaining the southern entity as tactical partner rather than territorial enemy served strategic interests. The calculation was simple. The execution would require continued adaptation. But adaptation was survival, and survival was the only metric that mattered. He turned his attention to rebuilding his forces. The battle had depleted his undead reserves significantly. Hundreds destroyed, Valkyr lost, infrastructure damaged, but intelligence gained, capabilities demonstrated. Alliance established that provided security beyond what isolation could achieve. Acceptable exchange. The helm pulsed against his temples, feeding him data from across his territory. Undead moving in coordinated patterns. Frost spreading with controlled precision. Everything proceeding according to plan. And far to the south, another power followed its own plans, occasionally intersecting with his own. The Lich King found this arrangement tolerable, for now. Cardinal Raymond sealed the final report and filed it in archives that would inform theocracy policy for decades. Two undead powers had emerged, fought to stalemate, negotiated ceasefire, coordinated against mutual threat, and now maintained ongoing cooperation that showed no signs of degrading into renewed conflict. The implications were staggering. Nations could no longer rely on undead being mindless evil to be eliminated. These entities thought strategically, acted pragmatically, and adapted to circumstances with disturbing efficiency. The theocracy's doctrine required revision. Not abandonment, faith still provided moral framework, but adaptation. Recognition that the world contained powers that couldn't be categorized as simple evil. Raymond had already begun drafting proposals. New diplomatic protocols for dealing with undead nations, intelligence-sharing frameworks that didn't require theological compromise, strategic positioning that acknowledged reality while maintaining principles where possible. Berenice had called him pragmatic. Dominic had called him cynical. Yvonne had simply nodded and asked what orders to give military forces. All of them understood adapt or become irrelevant. The choice was that simple. Raymond stood from his desk, walked to the window overlooking the theocracy's capital. Somewhere beyond the horizon, two undead powers were rebuilding from battle that had nearly destroyed them both. And the theocracy would need to find its place in a world where undead diplomacy was more effective than crusades. He'd pray for guidance. Then he'd make the hard decisions survival required. In that order, always. The minor kingdoms responded to the northern crisis with predictable panic and opportunistic maneuvering. Some sought closer ties with Nazarick, recognizing protection value. Others fortified against all undead, regardless of demonstrated cooperation. A few tried to position themselves as mediators between powers. None of them understood the fundamental shift that had occurred. The New World's power structure had reorganized itself around two undead nations that could coordinate when survival required it. Everything else, kingdoms, alliances, traditional power blocks, operated in the shadow of that reality. Trade routes adjusted, military deployments repositioned, diplomatic protocols evolved to account for entities that negotiated through exchange of magical intelligence rather than traditional statecraft. The world was changing, slowly, inevitably. And those who recognized the change early gained advantage over those who clung to comfortable assumptions. Deep beneath the reinforced ice, the devourer waited. It didn't rage against its prison, didn't plot elaborate escape. Such concepts implied emotional investment it didn't possess. It simply existed. Patient as geology, inevitable as entropy. The bindings would degrade eventually. All structures failed given sufficient time. When that occurred, it would emerge again. And the small entities would respond. Perhaps more effectively, having learned from this encounter. Perhaps less effectively, having grown complacent. The outcome was uncertain. But the devourer had patience measured in millennia. It could wait. 14 days after the battle, Cocytus opened his eyes in Nazarick's resurrection chamber. The process had worked. Not perfectly, his memories of the final moments remained fragmented, but sufficiently. He was restored, functional, ready to serve. Ains stood over him, skeletal face betraying no emotion, but presence communicating everything necessary. "Welcome back, Cocytus, my lord." The words came slowly, voice reconstructing along with body. "Did we win? We won. The entity is contained. Mayor completed the binding because you protected him. Your sacrifice was not wasted." Cocytus processed this, cataloged the information, understood that his death had served purpose. "Then I am satisfied." Albedo appeared at the doorway, golden eyes gleaming with relief she didn't bother to conceal. "Lord Ains, the Lich King sends message. He wishes to acknowledge Cocytus's contribution to the victory." Ains nodded. "Transmit our gratitude for the sentiment, and inform him that Cocytus has been successfully restored." The Guardian coordination that had fought the Devourer remained intact. The cooperation that had seemed temporary was proving more durable than anyone anticipated. Ains looked at Cocytus, then at Albedo, then beyond to where Demiurge was no doubt analyzing this entire situation for strategic implications. Nazarick was secure, for now. The northern territories were stable, for now. The world had changed in ways no one fully understood yet, for now. But for now was all anyone ever really had. And Ains Ual Gaun formerly, Suzuki Satoru, perpetually uncertain, eternally improvising, had learned to make for now sufficient. One crisis at a time, one decision at a time, one unlikely alliance at a time. It wasn't the future he'd expected, but it was the future they'd survived to see. And that would have to be enough. Winter settled over the new world. Natural winter, not the supernatural freeze that had heralded the Lich King's arrival. Snow fell in patterns determined by weather rather than magic. In the north, undead continued their organized expansion. In the south, Nazarick maintained its careful dominion. Between them, an uneasy partnership addressed threats neither could handle alone. The Devourer slept beneath reinforced ice. The theocracy adapted its doctrine. Minor kingdoms navigated new political realities. And deep in Nazarick's throne room, Ains Ual Gaun sat surrounded by guardians who believed in him, absolutely considering challenges that would come next. Because there would always be next challenges. But he'd faced them the same way he'd faced everything since arriving in this world. With improvisation, with paranoia, with subordinates brilliant enough to execute genius from his uncertainty, and now, apparently, with an unlikely ally who understood that survival sometimes required setting aside competition for mutual benefit. The future was uncertain, but the present was stable. And for an undead overlord who'd started as a salaryman playing a game that was more than he'd ever expected to achieve. Winter passed into spring, and the world continued turning, carrying them all toward whatever came next.